Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deepest part of the night. Make sure you're comfortable and fully settled in for a long one. Tonight, we're blending the soothing sound of the rain with unsettling and chilling stories, so you can truly let go and relax. If this mix of calm and unease feels like your kind of escape, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss more long, rainy nights of narrative dread. Also, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. Now, let the rain surround you, and allow the stories to pull you into the night. Story 1. The truth is, when I first saw the house, I thought it was perfect. Not perfect in the modern, move-in ready sense, but perfect in the way that old things are perfect, full of history, character, and the promise of a huge amount of sweat equity. It was a 3-story colonial revival just outside of Concord, Massachusetts, built around 1910. I'd bought it for a steal, a genuine, no-kidding steal, because it had sat vacant for over 5 years, its previous owner having moved into assisted living, and the heirs wanting nothing to do with the place. The realtor kept muttering about the unique energy, which I dismissed as standard sales jargon. To me, it was just cedar shingles, thick plaster walls, and a beautiful, if neglected, grand staircase. I was a single guy, a self-employed architectural restorer, and I was going to make this house my masterpiece, my home, and my financial security blanket all at once. The first few weeks were a dream. I was working 12-hour days, tearing out decades of decaying wallpaper, sanding the original heart pine floors, and breathing in the glorious smell of old wood dust and turpentine. The house had a solid, grounded feel to it, a reassuring heaviness that comes from quality construction. I even enjoyed the solitude. No traffic noise, just the sound of my orbital sander and the distant chirping of birds in the surrounding woods. Then came the cold. It was mid-August, brutally hot and humid, the kind of Massachusetts summer where the air itself feels like a wet blanket. I had the windows open, a box fan roaring in the hallway, and I was still sweating through my shirt. I was in the library, a small room off the main hall, carefully stripping paint from a built-in bookshelf. I knelt down to plug in a drop light, and as my hand reached the baseboard, a pocket of air hit my skin. It wasn't a draft. It was cold. Not cool, but genuinely frigid, the kind of biting cold that makes your joints ache. It was so localized that it felt like I'd stuck my hand into an open freezer. I pulled back, blinked, and stood up, looking around. The fan was blowing air into the library. The nearest window was closed. I walked a few steps away, and the heat was oppressive again. I returned to the spot, bent down, and the cold was there, emanating from the baseboard in a specific, 2-foot wide section. It was constant, heavy, and unnaturally still. I touched the wall itself. The plaster was icy to the touch. I checked the pipes, no water lines nearby, just electrical conduit. I spent a good half hour trying to rationalize it, maybe a broken seal in the foundation, a weird air current from the basement. I even put a thermometer on the floor. It read 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, it was 88. Well, that's certainly unique energy, I muttered, shivering despite the sweat clinging to my back. I taped a piece of contractor plastic over the section of the wall, convinced I'd find a structural problem later, and went back to work. I told myself I was just tired. But the cold spot was just the appetizer. The real disturbances started a few days after I began spending the night there. I'd set up a makeshift bedroom on the second floor, a mattress on the floor in what would eventually be the master suite. My tools were all stored neatly in the dining room, covered by drop cloths. I was meticulous about my cleanup. A place for everything. One morning, I went downstairs to start work, and my favorite hammer, a heavy framing hammer that never left my side, was sitting squarely on the middle of the grand staircase, resting on the 3rd step up. I distinctly remembered placing it in my red toolbox in the dining room the night before. I stared at it for a full minute. Maybe I'd been more tired than I thought? Maybe I'd carried it up to the bedroom and dropped it on the way down, then walked right past it. It was a clumsy thought, but it was a thought, a logical path. But the next night, it escalated. I was woken around 3 a.m. by a noise that sounded like a very heavy book hitting a wooden floor. Thud. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. I listened hard, straining against the silence. Nothing. I tried to dismiss it as the house settling. The sounds of old wood contracting. But the noise hadn't been a groan or a creak. It had been an impact. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand, the heavy beam cutting a swath through the dark hallway. I checked the 3rd floor first, the spooky, unfinished attic space I hadn't touched yet. The door was closed. I checked the 1st floor. All the doors leading outside were locked and chained. I finally got to the library, where the initial cold spot had been. Nothing out of place. I checked the dining room, where the tools were. Everything was under the drop cloths. It wasn't until I reached the kitchen that I found something. A single, antique ceramic teacup, a remnant left by the previous owner, was sitting on the center of the kitchen floor. It was the only item left in the cabinets, a chipped thing I was planning to toss. It hadn't fallen from a counter, it had been moved. It was placed there with almost deliberate care. My blood turned to ice water. This was no clumsy mistake. This was intentional. Over the next 2 weeks, the little acts of displacement became the norm. My paintbrushes would be found soaking in a bucket of dirty water, even though I'd cleaned and dried them. The screws I'd carefully sorted into small plastic containers would be poured out onto the floor, scattered like grains of rice. The radio I listened to while working would be turned on full blast in the middle of the night, always to the static between stations, a sharp, white noise that stabbed through my sleep. I tried to talk myself out of it. Raccoons, I decided. They were somehow getting in, playing with my things. I checked every inch of the foundation, every window, every flue. Not a single point of entry. The house was a sealed tomb, except for me. And maybe something else. I finally reached the point where I couldn't deny it anymore. This house, my beautiful, grand project, was occupied. Not by a quiet, sad ghost, but by something that was actively annoyed by my presence. A tenant who resented the renovation, the noise, and most of all, the idea of a new owner. The subtle acts gave way to overt aggression. The poltergeist activity began its true show. One afternoon, I was perched precariously on a scaffold, painstakingly working on the elaborate crown molding in the main drawing room. The room was silent except for my shallow breathing. Suddenly, the scaffolding shook. Not a gentle sway, but a violent, side-to-side jolt that nearly sent me tumbling 6 feet onto the hardwood floor. I gripped the railing, heart exploding in my chest. I screamed out. "What the hell was that?" I slowly descended, my body trembling. I examined the base of the scaffolding. It was perfectly level and stable. The floorboards around it were pristine. There was no earthquake, no passing truck. It was as if a massive, invisible hand had simply grabbed the structure and shaken it, purely to put me in danger. It was the first time the thing had directly threatened my physical well-being. The cold fear that washed over me was absolute. I started talking to it, a nervous habit that sprang from the isolation. "Look, I'm just fixing the place up. I'll be quiet, I'll be respectful. Just leave me alone." The silence that followed was heavy, almost mocking. The mimicry started a week later, and it was the most psychologically damaging thing it did. I was showering on the 2nd floor. The water was hot, the steam thick, and I was trying, for a few minutes, to forget where I was. Then I heard a noise from the bedroom. My name. "Ethan?" It was a soft whisper, but it was distinctly my own voice, not a recording, but my exact tone, my particular cadence when I asked a casual question. I shut off the water immediately, my heart leaping into my throat. "Who's there?" I called out, listening for the sound of a window opening or a door slamming. "Ethan, can you help me?" The voice came again, closer this time, just outside the bathroom door. It sounded exactly like me, weary, slightly rough from the dust, and just a little bit strained. I knew I was alone in the house. There were no other people, no radios, no speakers. I stood naked and dripping in the middle of the room. listening to my own voice call out to me in the dark. "Stop it!" I yelled, a frantic edge to my voice. The entity didn't speak again. Instead, it started a new sound, a slow, rhythmic tapping on the wooden bathroom door, the sound of my own index finger tapping my thigh when I was thinking hard. Tap, tap, tap. The imitation was a psychological weapon, an assertion that it knew me, that it was inside my head, and that it was preparing to take my place. I threw on a robe, grabbed a heavy crescent wrench, and flung the door open. The hallway was empty, but the air right in front of the door was the cold spot, amplified. It was so cold that a cloud of my own steam instantly condensed into a visible, white mist. And as the mist swirled, I saw, just for a fraction of a second, a flicker of shadow, not a person's shadow, but a dense, amorphous blot that recoiled instantly from my light. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up, the wrench on my lap, the light on, watching the hall. I understood then, this was a territorial spirit. It wasn't interested in being a sad ghost, it wanted the property. And to get the property, it had to get rid of the owner. Me. My rational mind, the mind that loved history and architecture, fought desperately against the terror. I started documenting everything, photos of the mess, recordings of the strange, low-frequency hums that now pervaded the house. I tried to find something in the town records. I found a few newspaper clippings. A family had lived there in the 40s, a father, mother, and 2 children. There was an obscure, unverified report of the father having had a mental breakdown, accusing his wife of locking me out of my own home, before he disappeared entirely. The house had been empty for a year before the mother moved out. Could he be the tenant? An entity so attached to the physical space that it literally believes it's the rightful, living owner? The final phase began a few weeks later. The entity stopped being subtle. It went for the kill. I was in the kitchen, making a miserable cup of instant coffee. It was late afternoon, and the sun was setting, casting long, dusty shadows. I heard a muffled sound from the basement. I had largely avoided the basement, a dark, humid, earthen-floored space that smelled of mildew and coal dust. Clang. Clang. Heavy metal striking concrete. I grabbed my flashlight and descended the narrow, rickety stairs. The air down there was different. It was thick, cloying, and carried a faint, metallic odor, like pennies and rust. I shined the light around. Nothing looked disturbed. All the old, empty shelves were still bolted to the wall. I reached the center of the basement, and the low-frequency hum, the one I'd been hearing in my recordings, was deafening down here. It vibrated in my teeth. The light beam suddenly flickered and died. I swore, my voice echoing weakly. Total, suffocating darkness. I fumbled for the spare flashlight I kept clipped to my belt. Before I could reach it, a violent, invisible force struck me squarely in the chest. It was like being hit by a lineman. The air exploded out of my lungs, and I flew backward, hitting the concrete wall with a sickening thud. I slumped to the floor, stunned, trying to drag breath back into my lungs. My head was ringing, and then I heard the voice. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a guttural, bass-heavy sound that seemed to come from the very floor beneath me, the earth itself. It was my voice, but distorted, slowed down, and filled with a cold, pure rage. Get out. This is mine. The words were agonizingly slow, each syllable a heavy hammer blow on my sanity. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, dragging my useless limbs along the damp dirt floor. As I moved, the sound of my own footsteps, heavy, deliberate, began to echo behind me, following me in the pitch dark. It was mimicking my movement. I finally got my spare light working, the beam revealing a small, cleared space where I had been standing. On the floor, scratched deeply into the old concrete, were 2 words carved not with a tool, but by something far more brutal: owner dies. I screamed, a raw, terrified sound. I scrambled up the stairs, taking 3 at a time, not caring about the splintering wood under my feet. I burst out of the basement and slammed the door shut, locking it with a heavy brass bolt. I didn't stop to pack. I didn't grab the blueprints. I didn't even turn off the lights. I ran to my truck, which was parked in the overgrown driveway, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely insert the key into the ignition. I peeled out of the driveway, the tires spitting gravel, and didn't look back. I drove until I hit the interstate and kept driving until the sun rose and the colonial house, my masterpiece, was hundreds of miles behind me. I never went back. I tried to sell the house remotely, telling the realtor only that the renovation was too much for me, and that I'd had a sudden change of plans. I sold it for even less than I bought it for, a massive financial loss, but a complete victory for my sanity. The new owner, a young, optimistic couple who, like me, thought they'd found a steal, called the realtor 6 weeks later. They didn't even ask for their money back. They just wanted to know if I had ever mentioned the humming, or the cold spot, or the fact that they couldn't keep a single photograph hung on the wall. They always found them face down, shattered on the floor, as if a child had thrown a tantrum. I told the realtor I had no idea what they were talking about. I had to. Because if I acknowledged it, it meant acknowledging that the house still has a tenant, a very real, very angry, and very territorial entity. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my new, small, utterly silent apartment, I hear a familiar noise from the hallway, just outside my door. It's a soft, weary whisper, exactly my voice, asking a single, chilling question. Ethan? Did you forget your key? Story 2. The name's Vince. I run a small, semi-legitimate consultancy that most people call a paranormal investigation service. I hate the word paranormal. It sounds like a bad 90s television show. I prefer anomalous data assessment. I'm not a ghost hunter. I'm a data guy who looks for the cracks in the world. And usually, the cracks are just bad wiring, faulty foundations, or deep-seated psychological trauma manifesting in predictable ways. In 10 years, I'd seen maybe 3 things I couldn't explain. I figured the odds were always in my favor. This case, however, was different from the jump. The client was the State Historical Society of West Virginia. They had acquired the old Fairmont Veterans Sanatorium, a sprawling, brutalist pile of brick and concrete that had been abandoned since the early 80s. They wanted to turn it into a museum. The problem? Local contractors were refusing to work on it, citing unstable atmosphere and the sounds. The society had been through 2 security firms already. Both had quit within a month, offering vague, terrified reasons that amounted to something in there doesn't want us to stay. I took the job because the retainer was obscene. I brought 2 people with me, Maya, my lead tech, a former electrical engineer with an almost religious devotion to calibration and logic, and Ben, a psych guy, specializing in environmental hysteria and suggestion. They're both skeptical to a fault, which is exactly why I hired them. We drove in from Pittsburgh in a beaten-up SUV packed with FLIR cameras, EM field readers, seismic sensors, and enough data loggers to monitor a small power plant. The sanatorium sat on a plateau overlooking a thick, ancient forest, a landscape that felt permanently shadowed. The first thing I noticed was the absolute, crushing silence. No birds. No crickets. Just the hiss of the wind through the broken panes of glass, and a kind of heavy, pressurized stillness. The air smelled of dust, mold, and something else, something metallic, like old pennies left in the rain. "Well, this looks like $1 million," Ben said, adjusting his backpack. He looked pale, even for him. Maya, already running baseline EMF readings, frowned. "EMF is low, Vince. Almost 0. Surprisingly clean, actually. No power lines nearby, no radio interference." "Perfect," I said, forcing a cheerful tone. "A clean slate. If anything happens, we know it's not the substation." Our setup was rigorous. We spent the first 48 hours not looking for spooks, but for infrastructure issues. We mapped the building, 4 floors, miles of dark corridors, a vast, decaying auditorium, and the locked, terrifying medical wing. We set up trip sensors, motion detectors, pressure plates, and full-spectrum video cameras in every critical area. We focused on the second floor, where most of the supposed activity, displaced objects, shadowy figures, had been reported. The second night, we had our first blip. We were reviewing the footage in our makeshift command center, the old laundry room, which had the only working outlet we could find. Maya was running the seismic logs. "Vince, look at this. 2:47 a.m., Sector 4B, North Corridor." She pulled up the data on the screen. It was a clear, sharp spike in the seismic activity, centered exactly in the middle of a locked patient room. "Rumble?" I asked. "Not a rumble. A thump. Low frequency, deep. Too heavy for a rat, too short for a structural shift. Play back the corresponding video," I ordered. The video was full spectrum, showing the dusty hallway in stark, unsettling black and white. We watched the time code roll. 2:47 a.m. In the dead center of the screen, the door to room 4B, a solid oak slab, bowed inward like something huge and soft had leaned against it. It wasn't a slam, it was a slow, heavy pressure. Then, just as the seismic spike peaked, the door snapped back, and the sound of something like a wet sack dropping on the other side of the door crackled over the audio feed. "No visible cause," I noted, my throat dry. "Pressure applied from the interior. Nothing registered on the exterior motion sensors." Ben, usually ready with a debunking theory about air pressure differentials, was quiet. He just stared at the screen. "Run the audio filter," Maya said, her voice flat. She isolated the audio from the room microphone. The crackling sound disappeared, and the silence returned. But then, a faint, rhythmic sound emerged, nearly subsonic. It sounded like a whisper that was too deep to be human, a sibilant, grinding noise, like coarse salt being rubbed together. "What is that?" I leaned closer. "Pitching up 10%, Maya said. The sound became slightly clearer, but no less terrifying. It sounded less like a language and more like pain being articulated by something without lungs. It was a dragging, scraping noise, accompanied by that deep, heavy breathing. "It's not human," I finally whispered, shaking my head. "The acoustic signature doesn't match any known phonetics. It's too deep, too slow." We spent the rest of the night poring over the data. What we experienced was not a friendly ghost, a residual haunting, or a person playing tricks. It was a calculated, physical demonstration of force. And the sound was the most disturbing evidence of all. The sanatorium, we discovered from the historical records, was built in the late 1910s directly on the site of a failed, deep-shaft coal mine. The mine had been abandoned 30 years prior to the hospital's construction after a catastrophic cave-in that entombed 12 men. They never recovered the bodies. The local legend, dismissed as folklore, was that the mine wasn't abandoned due to bad geology, but because the trapped miners had been heard after the cave-in, weeks later, tapping out patterns on the rock that weren't rescue codes, but demands. This information gave me a knot in my stomach. This wasn't about dead veterans. This was about the soil. The activity shifted from passive to highly aggressive after that night. It wasn't just noise anymore. We were setting up a new camera array in the medical wing, a claustrophobic area of small, tiled rooms and rusted equipment. I was in a former operating theater, a large, sunken room with a drain in the center of the floor. Maya and Ben were in the hall. Suddenly, I heard a sound directly behind me. A sharp, mechanical hiss, followed by a heavy drip. I spun around, my flashlight beam sweeping the room. The room was empty. But then I saw it. On the tiled wall, directly opposite me, the word, dig, had been scraped into the white ceramic. Not with a sharp tool, but with something blunt and powerful enough to gouge the tile and leave a line of pulverized ceramic dust beneath it. The dust was a dark, reddish-brown. "Maya! Ben! Get in here!" I yelled. They rushed in. Maya took one look at the scratched tile, then at the floor. "Vince, look at this," she said, pointing to the drain in the center of the room. The water in the drain, which we had previously established was completely dry, was now swirling slowly. It was not water. It was a thick, black, viscous liquid, smelling strongly of petroleum and decay. And it was rising. "That's not water. That's groundwater from deep down," I said, backing away quickly. "It's bringing something up." Ben, meanwhile, was focused on the scratch mark. "The height. It's too high for a normal man to reach so easily." He measured with a laser pointer. 7 feet 2 inches. "And look at the force. This is not a man, Vince. This is something massive." As we watched, the black fluid in the drain stopped rising, and instead began to bubble. The bubbles weren't gas. They were thick, sluggish eruptions that released a puff of that heavy, metallic earthy odor. And then, from the bubbling sludge came the sound. It was the same low, grinding noise from the tape, only louder, closer, and more deliberate. This time, it didn't sound like pain. It sounded like a focused, mocking laugh. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice barely a croak. "We pack up everything and analyze the data off-site." Now, the confrontation in the medical wing cemented it for me. We weren't dealing with a soul. We were dealing with something elemental, tied to the deep earth, the pressure, and the buried trauma of the site. It wasn't a ghost of a miner. It was a demon of the soil. A djinn of the mine, angered by the hospital's presence, and now by ours. The local folklore wasn't just folklore. The demands the trapped miners had been tapping out weren't for rescue. They were the price of their lives, paid to the thing that had claimed the deep ground. We retreated to the command center to hastily dismantle the equipment. The sanatorium was not happy we were leaving. The silence was gone. The entire building was now vibrating with that deep, incessant hum. I was pulling the last of the server drives when I heard a small, desperate shout from the end of the hall. It was Maya. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and ran toward her. She was frozen at the doorway, pointing down the main north corridor. The hall was pitch black, but my light was strong. And there, at the far end, perhaps 100 yards away, was a figure. It was not a hazy, translucent ghost. It was a man, tall and impossibly thin, dressed in what looked like a tattered, heavy burlap sack over his head and shoulders. He was standing perfectly still. The air around him was shimmering, not with heat, but with a kind of visible, dense energy, like the air above asphalt on a very hot day. "Don't move," I whispered to Maya. But then, the figure began to move. It didn't walk. It flowed, like heavy smoke or oil, gliding towards us with an unnerving, deliberate speed. It raised a hand, a long, desiccated thing with fingers that were too long and ended in black, pitted nails. And from where its mouth should have been, underneath the burlap, came a sound that froze my blood. It wasn't the grinding. It was a perfect, chilling imitation of Ben's voice, calling out in a tone of pure, unadulterated terror. "Vince! Help me! The pressure! The pressure is too much!" I looked back at Maya. Her face was white. "Where is Ben?" I hissed. "He went to the car to load the heavy equipment 15 minutes ago." The figure's imitation was a trap. It was trying to lure us down the hall and separate us. The sheer malevolence of the mimicry, using our friend's voice in a moment of distress, was the final, undeniable piece of evidence. This was an intelligent predator. "Back to the car, Maya!" "No," I ordered, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the back exit. As we ran, I risked a look back. The figure had stopped moving, but the air around it was vibrating with such intensity that I could see the old plaster on the walls of the corridor beginning to crack and powder around it. It gave one last sound. It was the grinding, deep whisper, overlaid this time with the desperate, choked-off sound of a man struggling for breath. It was feeding. We burst out of the back door, our lungs burning. Ben was standing by the SUV, already halfway loaded, looking confused by our panic. "What the hell took you guys?" he asked. "Get in! Get in now, Ben!" I screamed, pushing him into the passenger seat. I threw the remaining equipment in the back and slammed the hatch. I didn't care about the Historical Society's money anymore. I didn't care about the data. I just wanted the miles between me and that deep, crushing sound. As I started the engine, I looked back at the sanatorium. The windows on the second floor, the ones lining the north corridor, suddenly went dark, as if a thick curtain had been drawn behind them. The oppressive silence had returned. We drove for 2 hours, not saying a word. Finally, when we stopped at a gas station, I told them everything. I told them about the dig, the black sludge, and the figure that had tried to lure us with Ben's voice. Maya, the engineer, was quiet. She took out the seismic log drives and pulled up the data from the past hour. "Vince," she said, her hands shaking, "listen to this." She played the final audio log from the basement sensors we had left running. The deep, heavy hum was there. But under it, a faint, rhythmic sound began. It was the sound of a single person tapping on a hard surface. Not frantic. Not demanding. But a slow, deliberate pattern. "That's a code," Ben said, his voice husky. "Morse code," Maya translated. The message was short, repeated over and over, growing fainter as we drove away. It was only one word. "Hungry." I closed the lid of the laptop, the smell of dust and pennies still in my nostrils, and knew that the only thing we had accomplished was confirming the legend. The earth holds its secrets tight, but sometimes, when you drill too deep, the ancient things come looking for their payment. The sanatorium was a tomb, but what was buried was not a person. It was a predator. We drove all night, and I never looked at a seismic sensor the same way again. The earth is not silent. It is simply too deep for us to hear its demands. I pulled the rental SUV into the parking lot of a grim, fluorescent-lit motel 20 miles outside of Charleston. We were all running on adrenaline and stale coffee. No one was talking about the incident, but the silence was thick with the sheer, unadulterated fear we had shared. Ben, usually the most talkative, was staring out the window, occasionally scratching at his chest as if the burlap figure's hand had actually touched him. We booked 3 separate rooms, but within 10 minutes, all 3 of us were crowded into my room, the data drive spread out on the small, cigarette-burned desk. We needed to rationalize, to find the logical out, to prove that the sheer kinetic terror we'd experienced was just a confluence of factors. But the footage and the logs wouldn't let us. "Let's go back to the seismic," Maya said, her voice tight but professional. She pulled up the raw data from the evening of the confrontation. "This is the moment when the scratching started in the operating theater. Look at the amplitude." The spike on the graph was staggering, far beyond what any human-induced vibration could produce. It was the equivalent of a small wrecking ball hitting the foundation. It was pushing against the structure. I analyzed, pointing at the steep, non-decaying nature of the curve. Not hitting, pushing. Sustained force. Whatever it is, it's immensely powerful. Ben, his voice raspy, spoke up. "The scraping, Vince. I know you focused on the sound in the basement, but I was listening to the scrape on the tile. It was metallic, yes, but I heard a secondary sound underneath it. Like someone sighing heavily. Like a breath being expelled through wet material." He was a psych guy, specializing in audio suggestion, so I gave him the benefit of the doubt. Maya isolated the audio from the medical wing footage, dampening the high-end frequency of the ceramic scratching. What emerged sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. Underneath the harsh zzzt of the scraping, there was indeed a profound, shuddering exhale. It was long, slow, and ended in a sort of wet, clicking intake. It sounded like an enormous, starving animal finally getting a breath of air after being buried alive for decades. "That's the hunger," I murmured, running a hand through my already messy hair. It was writing dig because it wanted out. The physical effort of scraping the tile caused that forced exhale. But the true revelation came when Maya analyzed the EMF data from the moment the figure appeared in the north corridor. "The EMF was clean, right?" "0, she reminded us. "But look at this." She showed us a graph that made no sense. For the 3 minutes the figure was visible on camera and the motion sensor was tripped, the EMF didn't spike, it dropped. It didn't drop to 0, it dropped to a negative value. "Negative magnetic field?" Ben questioned, incredulous. "It's impossible," Maya countered, her engineer's brain rebelling. But that's what the calibrated reader recorded. It wasn't producing energy, it was consuming it. It was pulling the ambient electromagnetic energy out of the air, creating a local void. That's why the camera footage was so blurry and warped. It wasn't a shadow. The light itself was being robbed of its electromagnetic properties in that space. I leaned back, the image of the tall, shimmering, burlap-shrouded figure returning to me. It's a void, then. Not a ghost of a man, but a hole in the world, covered in the dirt it emerged from. And it was trying to lure us into that void. The next week was a blur of analysis. We confirmed the location of the old, sealed mine shaft under the sanatorium's main foundation. The building was literally resting on a crust of concrete poured over a deep hole where 12 men had perished. And according to the original geological reports, the mine had hit an unusually high concentration of iron and other heavy metals, the metallic odor we smelled. The site was electromagnetically active, but in a way that defied simple explanation. I realized what we had stumbled upon was a case of elemental haunting, a phenomenon driven not by the lingering soul of a human, but by a consciousness tied to the very rock and earth, using the death and trauma of the miners as a focal point, a channel. I started a deep dive into local Appalachian folklore, looking for anything that matched the description: tall, covered in earth, and associated with mines and deep places. I found several obscure references, always dismissed as superstitious tales used to scare children away from dangerous workings. The most chilling was the legend of the Rattle Man, or the Shaft Shambler. The stories always described the entity as a creature of great size and incredible strength, often covered in rock dust and soil, emerging from the depths when the living dug too far. Its most notable characteristic, however, was its voice. It was said that the Rattle Man could perfectly mimic the voice of a loved one, a wife, a child, or a fellow miner in distress, to lure its victim closer to the shaft, where it would claim them for the mine. They called it the voice of the soil's claim. The mimicry of Ben's voice, the plea for help, was the signature of the Rattle Man. It was the moment I stopped being a skeptic and became a believer in something terrifyingly old and powerful. We had all the data, all the answers, but we couldn't release them. No one would believe the negative EMF or the Rattle Man. The Historical Society would certainly bury it to save face and the property value. My initial thought was to write a long, detailed report and send it to the state, urging them to permanently seal the mine shaft with concrete. But Maya presented a counter-argument that truly terrified me. Vince, if this thing is elemental, a demon of the soil, what happens when you seal it in with concrete? You don't destroy it. You pressure cook it. You make it angrier. You don't plug a leak in a volcano. So what do we do? I asked, defeated. We neutralize the claim, she said, her eyes fixed on the map of the sanatorium. The legend says the Rattle Man can only claim what is near the mine. It is an aspect of the earth. We have to separate the earth from the spiritual focal point. We have to put something between the sanatorium and the thing in the shaft. She had found a reference to a forgotten, specific ritual practiced by old-time miners in the region, an appeasement, not an exorcism. It involved a large quantity of coarse salt and hallowed soil from a graveyard, specifically to create a protective barrier against things that came from the deep earth. It's ridiculous, Maya. We are serious data analysts. We are not doing a peasant ritual, I scoffed. It's about belief, Vince. If the Rattle Man is a consciousness that feeds on trauma and proximity, a barrier of intention might be the only thing that works. The folklore is the instruction manual. You said yourself, this thing isn't a ghost. It's a demon. And you don't fight a demon with a meter stick. The argument was compelling, mostly because my logic had utterly failed me. We were dealing with something outside the laws of physics. We had to use the laws of magic. We spent 2 days securing the materials, 20 pounds of industrial rock salt and a few buckets of soil from a pre-Revolutionary War cemetery, the hallowed ground aspect being key. We had to go back. I knew it was the stupidest, most dangerous thing I had ever done, but I couldn't live with the thought of leaving that hungry thing under the hospital. We returned to the sanatorium under the cover of a thick, rolling fog. The silence was back, even heavier this time. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath. We didn't enter the building. Our plan was simple: create a large, complete perimeter of salt and soil around the foundation, breaking the connection between the structure and the shaft below. The sun was setting, casting the sanatorium in a blood orange light. We moved quickly, working in absolute silence. Ben carried the heavy bags, Maya spread the salt in a continuous, unbroken line, and I followed, sprinkling the hallowed soil over the salt. As the line neared completion, the sanatorium began to fight back. It didn't start with a crash. It started with the smell. The metallic, earthy smell of the rattleman intensified 1,000-fold. It was so strong that it tasted like rusted blood in my mouth. Then came the sound. The low, grinding hum returned, but this time it was no longer coming from the building. It was coming from the ground itself, right at our feet. It was the sound of something immense shifting its weight deep, deep below us. Maya was working on the back corner of the building when she screamed, "Vince! The ground!" I turned. Where the salt line should have been, the earth was blackening. The soil wasn't just turning dark, it was literally rejecting the salt. The white grains were sinking into the black mud, disappearing as if consumed. And where the salt vanished, the ground was subtly swelling, like a massive lung inflating beneath the topsoil. From the swollen ground, a voice emerged. It wasn't the human mimicry. It was the rattleman's true voice, the deep, grinding whisper, raw and full of agonizing, cold fury. "You take what is mine." The voice seemed to wrap itself around us, not just in our ears, but in our bones. I felt an immense, physical pressure on my chest, the exact same feeling Ben had described, the sensation of being buried alive. "Keep going! Don't break the line!" I shouted to Maya, my voice trembling. I sprinted toward the corner, frantically pouring the last of my hallowed soil. I saw the black earth surge upwards, trying to breach the line, trying to touch Maya's feet. Just as I reached her, a section of the sanatorium's second floor wall, the very section outside room 4B, burst outward. Not an explosion, but a sudden, violent, internal displacement. Bricks, glass, and pulverized plaster rained down. And through the new, jagged hole in the wall, I saw it. The rattleman. It was no longer shrouded in burlap. It was massive, a towering pillar of mud, rock dust, and compacted earth, easily 10 feet tall. Its features were indistinct, save for two huge, glowing red eyes that burned with the heat of the earth's core, and two long, rock-like arms that ended in massive, spade-like hands. It didn't step out. It simply stretched its arm across the distance, a terrifying extension of its body. The arm shot out, tearing through the air towards us, its goal the incomplete salt line. "Now, Maya!" We simultaneously flung the remaining salt and soil, completing the circle just as the creature's immense, stony hands slammed into the ground right where we had been standing. The impact was deafening. The ground shook violently. But the line held. When the hand tried to pass over the combined barrier of salt and hallowed soil, it didn't just stop. It seemed to sizzle. The earth and rock dust of the creature's arm recoiled instantly, shrinking back from the white line as if from a powerful acid. The rattleman pulled back its arm, letting out a sound of pure, unholy frustration, a screech that mixed the grinding of rock with the deepest, most tortured human scream imaginable. It stood motionless for a moment, its red eyes fixed on us, radiating intense hatred. Then, slowly, deliberately, the immense form of packed earth and shadow began to sink back into the hole it had ripped in the wall. The sound of the hum faded, the smell began to dissipate, and the pressure on our chests released. We stood there for a long time, watching the hole in the wall, until the fog was gone and the moon was high. The sanatorium was silent again. The oppressive silence of an angry, defeated predator. We drove away. We sent the Historical Society an anonymous, highly detailed report about the structural integrity of the mine shaft, complete with seismic data, but we purged all the anomalous logs. We told them the only solution was to permanently seal the area with an entirely new unbroken concrete cap over the entire foundation. They took the advice, terrified by the structural damage they had discovered. I never heard from them again. I went back to my data analysis, my skepticism fractured but not destroyed. I still look for the logical cracks. But now, I know that sometimes the crack is just an entry point for something that was there long before we ever were. Something that is only waiting for the salt to dissolve so it can make its claim. And every time I hear a deep, low rumble that I can't explain, I check the ground, not the sky. Because I know that the most terrifying things are the ones that have been waiting for us right beneath our feet. Story 3. When my wife left, she didn't leave a note. She left a scent. Not perfume, but the raw, unwashed smell of the earth clinging to the linen curtains. She'd always been drawn to the wild, and when she finally broke, it wasn't a sudden crack. It was a slow, deliberate erosion, like the ocean reclaiming a coastline. I was left with a silence that swallowed the sound of the city and a studio full of canvases I couldn't bear to touch. I needed to disappear. To trade the noise of guilt for a silence I could manage. That's how I found the cabin. It was tucked away in the deep, wet embrace of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state, advertised simply as secluded writer's retreat. The photos showed a weather-beaten cedar structure nestled in a perpetual twilight of enormous, ancient Sitka spruce and western hemlock. It was perfect. A place where nothing could find me. The first days were a strange kind of medicine. The air was thick and cool, smelling of moss, decaying leaves, and the distant, unseen Pacific. The cabin was primitive, wood stove, no Wi-Fi, and a generator I only ran for a few hours in the evening. I spent my mornings walking the trails, absorbing the green. It wasn't just a color here. It was a physical presence, a dense, dark atmosphere that pressed down on the forest floor. The trees weren't just tall. They were colossal, their canopies so dense that the sun rarely touched the ground. Everything was draped in vibrant, velvet green moss, the very definition of the word. Overgrown. I started painting again. Not on canvas, but on the inside of the cabin. I was stripping the hideous 70s paneling in the main room when I decided to use the bare wood as my medium. Abstract expressionism, violent slashes of black and deep forest green, an attempt to capture the internal storm and the external pressure. It was purely therapeutic, an act of exorcism. The first shift happened around the start of the third week. I had been sitting on the porch, nursing a cup of coffee, listening to the drip of condensation. I looked down at my hands. They were covered in a thin film of green dust. I hadn't been sanding or painting. I hadn't touched anything dusty. It was the same vivid, slightly fluorescent shade of green as the moss that coated the exterior of the cabin. I wiped them on my jeans, but the dust seemed to cling to the oils of my skin, absorbing into the pores. Over the next few days, I noticed the dust everywhere. On the rim of my coffee cup. On the pages of my journal. And then, I noticed it collecting on my skin when I woke up, as if it had been expelled from my sweat. I felt an inexplicable compulsion to go deeper into the woods, past the boundary markers I had initially respected. The forest here was different. It wasn't welcoming or hostile. It was utterly indifferent. It didn't care if I lived or died. But it was alive. One afternoon, I was deep in a forgotten part of the woods, following a game trail. I came across a clearing that wasn't a clearing at all. It was a space where the trees simply leaned away from a single, massive boulder, completely covered in moss, sitting on a bed of ferns. The air around the rock was absolutely still and heavy. It felt like standing in front of an ancient, sleeping thing. And then I heard it, a sound so quiet it was more of a thought than an auditory experience. It was the softest humming, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to emanate not from the air, but from the rock itself, resonating up through the soles of my boots. It felt like a low, contented purr. I found myself kneeling before the rock, completely compelled. I reached out and gently touched the moss. It was damp, soft, and alive. I stayed there for over an hour, just absorbing the silence and the hum, feeling the dust on my skin prickle with an unknown energy. When I finally stood up, I felt a strange sense of clarity, but also a profound, unsettling coldness in my core. My behavior began to change. I stopped shaving. I stopped bathing regularly. The scent of pine and soil became preferable to soap. I found myself looking at my leftover food with disdain and a new, sharp craving for raw, unsalted things. Berries, moss, and the crisp, clean taste of running stream water became the only things that truly satisfied me. The cabin started to feel wrong. The straight lines of the walls, the glass in the windows, they were an offense. A barrier against the thing that was calling me. I began to paint differently. The violent slashes disappeared. My new work became meticulous, detailed, and utterly alien. I was painting roots. Not the brown, brittle roots of a dead stump, but thick, coiling, vibrant green roots, running across the wooden walls, up to the ceiling, all connecting back to a single, central point on the floor. I wasn't painting a subject. I was painting an infrastructure. I didn't think of my wife or my past anymore. The guilt was gone, replaced by a strange, focused purpose. The forest had cleansed me, replacing my pain with its own, slow, vegetal intelligence. I was becoming unburdened. The true sign of my possession was not the painting or the dirt. It was the eyes. I caught my reflection one evening in the dark glass of the window, illuminated by the oil lamp. I looked different. Gaunt, yes, but it was the eyes. They were wide, unblinking, and held a flat, mossy green color that hadn't been there before. They were the eyes of a creature that watches, not thinks. The eyes of a man who no longer needed to blink because the darkness was no longer something to be feared. I knew, with the calm certainty that only madness can provide, that the forest was working through me. The hum from the boulder, the green dust, it was all an infusion. I was no longer an occupant of the cabin. I was a spore. The final, terrifying step was the sound of the ground. I was sleeping on the floor, having discarded the mattress because it felt too manufactured. I was woken by a faint, persistent noise, a clicking sound just outside the cabin wall, near the baseboard. Click, click, click. It sounded like heavy, blunt fingernails tapping on dry wood, but it had a strange, deliberate rhythm. I got up, grabbed my heavy axe, and walked outside into the chilling, damp night. The moon was barely visible through the canopy, but there was enough light to see the foundation. The clicking stopped the moment I emerged. I swept the area with my flashlight. Nothing. Then I looked down. The roots of the massive trees, the ones that had always been there, were moving. Not quickly, but with an agonizing, slow unfurling motion. The thick, snake-like protrusions were extending themselves, pushing toward the cabin's wooden foundation. They weren't growing, they were reaching. The cabin, my retreat, was becoming the host. I knew what the clicking sound was. It was the sound of the life outside trying to merge with the life inside. It was the sound of the green dark trying to pull the structure down, to cover it, to digest it. The forest was making a slow, physical play to erase the unnatural lines of the building and fully reclaim its space. I ran back inside, slamming the door and locking the bolt. The cold, logical part of my brain, the small piece that had not yet been consumed by the green dust, screamed at me, "Get out! The forest is trying to turn you into a tree." But the other part, the quiet, humming part, simply watched the floorboards. It knew the roots were coming, and it was waiting for them. The battle for my sanity, my life, and my soul had come down to a race between the logic of the axe and the call of the hum. And the hum was winning. I spent the next 2 days in a state of suspended animation, moving with the slow, deliberate motions of a deep-sea creature. The generator remained silent. The cabin was lit only by the weak, hazy light filtering through the dense canopy and the perpetual glow of the wood stove. I hadn't eaten a proper meal. The thought of cooked food was repulsive. I was surviving on foraged berries and the thin, metallic taste of the stream water. The green dust was heavier now. It wasn't just on my hands and face. It was caked in my hair, dusting the collar of my flannel shirt, and forming a fine, unsettling patina on all the surfaces in the cabin. The wood stove, my last connection to domesticity, was cool, its metallic surfaces filmed with a layer of mossy green. The compulsion to paint had intensified into a feverish need to complete the infrastructure. I used my own blood when the last of the deep green paint ran out, mixing it with crushed, vibrant moss I'd scraped from the outer walls. The roots on the interior paneling had grown intricate, a chaotic tapestry of lines that connected the floor to the ceiling, the windows to the stove, all leading back to that single, invisible point on the floor. It was a circuit board for a profound, vegetal consciousness. I was working on the far wall, connecting a thick, blood and moss root to a knot in the pine. I was completely engrossed, my mind a blank slate except for the logic of the pattern. And then I heard the sound of water dripping from the ceiling. Plink, plink, plink. It wasn't condensation. It was far too regular and heavy. I looked up. The ceiling beams were old, but they were sound. And yet, directly above the center of the room, there was a small, wet patch forming on the wood. I stood on a stool, peering up at the patch. It wasn't just water. It was a thick, syrupy liquid, dark amber in color, and it smelled intensely of pitch and decaying sap. As I watched, the liquid slowly, agonizingly, began to seep through the wood grain, forming a fat, shimmering drop. Plink. The drop hit the floor with a heavy, sucking sound. And where it landed, the bare wood instantly darkened and began to emit a faint, organic odor, like freshly cut fungus. The liquid wasn't moisture. It was the cabin weeping sap, releasing the stored lifeblood of the trees it was made from. It was bleeding, not from being wounded, but from being overcome. The humming from the woods intensified, no longer a purr, but a deep, resonant chord that seemed to press in on my eardrums. I could feel the vibrations in my chest, a physical confirmation that the forest was ecstatic. It was almost done. I realized with terrifying clarity that the green dark wasn't just claiming the space. It was assimilating the materials. The wood I had used as my canvas, the structure I was living in, was being reabsorbed into the collective, non-sentient life force of the forest. And I was simply a piece of it, the most complex organic unit, waiting to be integrated. That night, the true horror of my mental possession manifested. I didn't sleep. I just sat on the floor, my back against the wall, listening to the cabin creak and groan as the roots outside continued their slow, physical march toward the foundation. I started to whisper to myself, not my own thoughts, but phrases that came from a place entirely outside my consciousness. They weren't in English. They were an amalgamation of deep, resonant sounds, clicks, and sibilant hisses, the language of the sap and the soil. Unmake the straight line. The sun is a trespasser. Sleep in the shadow of the colossal ones. I had become the medium for the genius loci, the spirit of the place. It was preparing me for the final merger, conditioning my human mind to accept the absolute surrender of my individuality. My purpose, I finally understood, was not to live in the cabin, but to die in it, leaving behind a fully assimilated structure, a new part of the green dark. The fear was almost entirely gone. It had been replaced by a strange, cold acceptance, an almost euphoric sense of belonging. The pain of my guilt, the loneliness of my life, all of it seemed like a distant, irrelevant human disease. The only thing that mattered was the root structure and the hum. But then, a memory flared. A flash of pure, agonizing human emotion, not my own, but hers. My wife's face, pale and distant, illuminated by the dashboard light on the night she drove away. And the deep, wrenching sadness in her eyes. She left because I was already becoming something else. The memory was an anomaly, a human glitch in the vegetal program. It was a connection to the world I had abandoned. The sudden, brutal influx of pure human pain was like a psychic lightning bolt. It violently fractured the calm, humming acceptance the forest had instilled. I cried out, a sound of agony and confusion, and stumbled backward, hitting the back of my head on the wooden wall. The shock was enough to momentarily break the spell. For the first time in weeks, I saw the room clearly. Not as a canvas of roots, but as a dirty, terrifying prison. The green dust on my skin felt toxic. The dried blood and moss on the walls looked like the work of a madman. I saw my face, reflected in the dark window, the terrifying, unblinking green eyes. I have to leave. Now. The impulse was primal, a desperate, final surge of self-preservation. I needed to get out of the structure before the roots broke through. I ran to the main door, fumbling with the deadbolt. As I touched the cold metal, the forest reacted instantly. The humming outside intensified into a screech, 1,000 tiny, high-pitched vibrations, like the sound of grinding wood and millions of insects. The cabin began to tremble. The dripping from the ceiling accelerated, becoming a steady, thick stream of pitch-like sap. I looked down, and the floorboards beneath my feet were no longer flat. They were warping, bowing upward, straining against the invisible pressure from below. And then I heard the roots. They weren't clicking anymore. They were tearing. RRRIP. A long, splintering sound came from the corner of the cabin where the cold spot had always been. I looked over and saw a thin, black line appear in the wooden wall, instantly filling with the amber sap. Then, with a slow, agonizing heave, the seam split open. A thick, dark protrusion, covered in dirt and green moss, slowly pushed through the gap. It was a root, as thick as a man's arm, rigid with unnatural, malevolent purpose. It twisted in the air like a snake, its tip searching. I pulled the door open and scrambled out, not caring about the clothes or the keys, just the distance. I ran blindly down the path toward the road, the thick fog and the deeper darkness of the colossal trees surrounding me. I could hear the cabin behind me, not crashing, but groaning as the roots tore at its foundation, slowly dismantling the human structure. I ran until my lungs felt like they were on fire, until I burst out of the tree line and onto the narrow, gravel access road. I kept running until I reached the main highway, where the presence of pavement and the occasional distant car sound felt like the return of sanity. I hailed a truck and ended up in a dingy hotel room in Port Angeles. I sat on the clean, sterile bed for hours, shivering, staring at the perfectly white walls. The next morning, I looked in the mirror. I was filthy, scratched, and my eyes were sunken. But they were brown again. The green film was gone. The dust, the terrifying green dust, had washed away in my panic and sweat. I stayed in the city, never returning to the cabin. The logical part of me eventually won. I filed a missing persons report on myself and slowly reintegrated into life, starting with clean, simple canvases. I could never paint abstractly again. The roots had corrupted the form. But sometimes, on a humid day, when I'm alone in my apartment, I feel a strange pressure on my skin. I instinctively raise my hands and look at them under the light. And there, clinging to the faint oil of my pores, I can always see a few, almost invisible, microscopic grains of bright green dust. And in the deepest, most quiet corner of my mind, I can still hear the faint, low humming of the sleeping rock, waiting for me to forget the sunlight and return to the unconditional, ancient embrace of the green dark. The shock of what I had done, abandoning everything, fleeing in the middle of the night like a frightened animal, eventually wore off, replaced by the grim logistics of survival. I had a few $100s in cash and a wallet full of unusable plastic. My truck, my tools, my life, and my past were still up in that valley, in a cabin being slowly digested by the earth. I was, for all intents and purposes, a new man, and a poor one at that. I found menial work in a fishing supply warehouse near the docks. The heavy, greasy smell of salt, oil, and fish guts was a merciful antidote to the clean, deep smell of moss and pitch that still haunted my dreams. I needed the constant, mundane noise of humanity, the shouts of the dock workers, the clanging of the forklifts, the whine of ship horns, to drown out the memory of the hum. But the escape hadn't been a clean break. The green dark was patient, and it had invested too much of its peculiar energy in me to simply let me go. It started small. In my tiny, furnished room above a questionable bar, I started noticing spores. They weren't the vibrant green dust from the cabin. These were white, almost translucent, tiny specks that floated in the air when the light hit them just right. They looked like pollen, but I was in a concrete jungle, weeks away from any forest bloom. I tried to clean them. I scrubbed the walls. I bought an air purifier. I washed my clothes 5 times a week. But the spores were always there, a faint, visible haze in the air, a constant reminder that I had carried a piece of the forest with me. I developed a persistent, low-grade cough, a tightness in my chest that no amount of clean air could alleviate. I felt like I was slowly, perpetually breathing in the deep, damp air of the Olympic Peninsula. The cough was the physical manifestation. The psychological effect was far more insidious. The logic of the roots began to assert itself in my rational world. I found myself obsessively analyzing the patterns of things. The cracks in the pavement outside the warehouse. The way the electrical wires intersected with the telephone cables overhead. The intricate web of ropes and knots on the fishing trawlers. They were all just root structures, attempts by the human world to create connection, stability, and flow. I started to see the world not as a collection of independent objects, but as a single, sprawling, interconnected organism, much like the green dark. The city was just a different kind of forest, built of concrete and steel instead of wood and sap. And I was still connected to it, still part of the flow. One evening, I was riding the bus back to my room, feeling the usual anxiety about the spores and the cough. I looked down at my hands. The veins under the skin, the blue and green lines of my own circulatory system, suddenly looked terrifyingly familiar. They were the final root structure, the internal pattern that led back to the central source. I had a panic attack right there on the bus. I jumped off at the next stop and sprinted until I reached a public park. I stood under a street lamp, my body shaking, and looked up at the moon, desperately trying to re-establish my connection to the sky, to the inorganic, to the world outside the earth. I knew then that the possession wasn't over. It had simply shifted from a physical occupation of the cabin to a mental occupation of my mind. The forest couldn't pull me down physically, so it was trying to dismantle my rationality and turn me into a vehicle for its peculiar, vegetal intelligence. The most terrifying moment came 2 months after my escape. I was finally starting to settle. I had a small savings account, a new set of clothes, and I was going to therapy, trying to rationalize the whole experience as a breakdown induced by grief and isolation. I was sitting in my room, sketching with a pencil, simple, geometric shapes, an intentional rebellion against the fluid chaos of the roots. I had the window open, letting in the cool night air. The spores were dancing in the light of my lamp. And then I heard it. A faint, low humming. It was barely audible, buried under the distant sounds of traffic and the bar music below. But it was there. The resonant, contented purr of the ancient rock, the sound of the sleeping thing. I froze, pencil hovering over the paper. I knew, rationally, that the cabin was hundreds of miles away. The sound was impossible. I got down on my hands and knees and pressed my ear to the wooden floorboards. The wood was cold and dusty. I heard the faint thump-thump of the music from downstairs. I pressed harder, closing my eyes, trying to filter out the noise. And then I felt it, a deep, slow vibration coming up through the foundation of the old building, through the concrete and the deep city earth. It wasn't the sound of the bar's bass. It was organic. It was geological. The humming was here. I scrambled back, knocking over my lamp. The terror that flooded me was worse than the initial fear of the roots, because this was absolute proof that the green dark was not confined to its forest. It was an intelligence that could travel through the earth itself, an immense, distributed consciousness that had followed me across the state. I spent the rest of the night barricaded against the door, watching the spores dance in the weak light of the street lamp outside the window. I realized that the forest hadn't sent a monster or a ghost to retrieve me. It had sent a thought. A relentless, patient, vegetal instruction to return. The next morning, I did the only thing I could think of. The only logical, yet completely mad, thing left to do. I went to the biggest hardware store I could find. I bought a heavy-duty shovel, a huge roll of contractor plastic, and 30 bags of pure rock salt. The coarse, crystalline, inorganic kind, the stuff that kills plants and melts snow. I couldn't fight the earth, but I could try to create a barrier against it. In the dead of night, I went to the park. The same park where I had had my panic attack. It was a terrible, desperate attempt at a reverse ritual. I started digging. I dug a deep, 2-foot wide trench in the middle of the park, working quickly and silently under the shadow of the tall oaks and maples that lined the area. As I dug, the humming grew louder, changing from a purr to a low, insistent growl. The earth itself seemed to be resisting my shovel. When the trench was complete, I began to pour the salt. Bag after bag, creating a deep, shining white line in the black soil. I was creating a perfect, inorganic line of defense, a wound in the earth, filled with a substance that rejected all life and growth. As the last bag emptied, I paused, heart hammering. The growl was now a vibrating roar. The branches of the oaks above me, though there was no wind, began to shake violently, as if in agony. And then I heard the voice. Not the hum, but the whispers again. Unmake the straight line. But the voice was different. It was weakened, fractured, as if it was being pulled apart by the crystalline structure of the salt. I threw the contractor plastic over the salt-filled trench, sealing it, a purely symbolic, insane act of defiance. Then I started to run. I left the park and walked until dawn, until the sun came up and hit me with its harsh, cleansing light. The possession is not cured, but the attack has ceased. I still cough. The green dust is still there, dancing in my small room. And sometimes, when I press my ear to the floor, I can still feel the faint, distant throb of the humming, a promise of a final reunion. But I know I bought myself time. A small, precious island of human sanity in a world that is slowly, patiently, turning green. I am a man fighting a forest, armed only with a memory and a deep fear of the ground beneath my feet. And the only thing keeping me alive is the thought that the roots haven't finished the job yet. Story 4. I never thought a sound could be the single defining element of my life, the axis upon which my sanity spun. But here we are. My name is Mark. I'm a technical editor, 40 years old, and 3 months ago, I moved into a renovated pre-war building in downtown Chicago, a monumental, gorgeous brick giant called the LaSalle. I splurged on an apartment on the 14th floor. Great view, thick walls, and the quiet dignity of a building that had stood since 1928. I thought I'd finally found my quiet sanctuary from the city's endless roar. The first few weeks were blissfully normal. Then, the noise started. It happened the first time on a Tuesday night. I was asleep, deep under, when a sound dragged me back to the surface of consciousness. It was 3:07 a.m. I know the time because I remember seeing the blinking red numbers on my digital clock. The sound was a low-frequency thrum, not a buzz, not a drill, but a heavy, pervasive vibration. It was too deep to be heard easily, but it could be felt in the bones of my inner ear and the pressure in my sinuses. It was a rhythmic, pulsing sound, like a gigantic, slow-moving washing machine directly overhead. I sat up, annoyed. This was a building full of high-paid professionals. Surely, they weren't running industrial machinery at 3 in the morning. I waited for it to stop. It didn't. It just pulsed, a monotonous, hypnotic thrum that felt like a droning lullaby sung by an immense, non-human throat. I got out of bed, went into the hallway, and listened. The sound was undeniably coming from the ceiling, the 15th floor. The next morning, I called the management office. I was polite but firm. I explained the noise, the time, the persistent thrum. The manager, a tired-sounding woman named Carol, consulted her screen. "Sir, I show no tenants currently residing in 1502, directly above you. The unit is vacant. Under renovation." "Well, then it's the renovation equipment," I insisted. "A dehumidifier, a fan, something left running. It's a huge, low hum." Carol promised to have the super check it out immediately. That night, I went to bed confident. 3 a.m. came and went. I smiled, relieved. Then, at 3:07 a.m., it started again. The heavy, slow, rhythmic thrum. It didn't stop until 5:30 a.m., when the first hint of morning light began to gray the windows. The super called me back the next day. "Mr. Vance, I went up to 1502. The unit is completely empty. No power to the main outlets, all switches off. I took an SBL meter, that's a decibel reader, and the noise floor was completely normal. I stood in the middle of that apartment for 20 minutes. Nothing. He sounded genuinely perplexed, maybe even slightly defensive. I hung up, staring at my ceiling. The man was either lying or incompetent, or the noise was being generated by something truly peculiar. Maybe an HVAC unit 2 floors up, transmitting sound through the thick piping and only coupling with my apartment at a specific time? I spent the rest of the day on Google, researching structural acoustics and low-frequency resonance. I was committed to a logical explanation. But the noise, the 14th floor lullaby, continued its nightly appointment. 3:07 a.m. Every night. A 2.5-hour concert of pure, mind-numbing vibration. I started losing sleep. The lack of sleep made me irritable and paranoid. I began to hear the hum even during the day, a phantom sensation, the mental echo of the nightly torment. One night I snapped. At 3:15 a.m., with the thrum pounding in my skull, I grabbed my keys and went up to the 15th floor. I stood outside 1502. I pressed my ear to the heavy oak door. Silence. Total, absolute silence. It was unnerving. The air in the hallway was still, cold. But when I took a step back and pressed my ear to the floor of the hallway, the ceiling of my own apartment, I could hear it, the low, vibrating thrum, muffled but distinct, coming from below the floorboards. I hammered on the door of 1502. Silence. I slammed my fist against the wall adjacent to my apartment. Silence. I stood there, trembling with rage and lack of sleep. The sound was not in the apartment above me. It was in the structure, only audible from the 14th floor. And only when I was trying to sleep. It was focused. The next day, I didn't call management. I went to the building archives. The LaSalle was a historic building, and I wanted to see the blueprints. I needed to understand what was directly above my unit. The blueprints were faded, massive scrolls. I found my unit, 1402. I traced the line upwards. The unit 1502 was indeed listed. But then I noticed something strange on the sectional drawings. The floor plan for 1502 was oddly empty. No kitchen. No bedroom partitions. Just a large, open space labeled Vertical Utility Shaft/Air Space. I pulled the full building cross-section. The 15th floor was not a residential floor. It was a gap. A maintenance level, designed to house oversized HVAC equipment and act as a structural damper between the residential floors below and the grand ballroom on the 16th floor. It wasn't vacant, it was designed to be empty. A layer of air, concrete, and pipework. The hum was coming from a place that wasn't supposed to contain anything large enough to create such a profound vibration. It was coming from empty space. The realization was a cold, paralyzing dread. The sound wasn't a mechanical malfunction. It was a deliberate, sonic presence in the dead space between the floors. The noise changed after that. Once I knew the logical answer was gone, the sound adapted. It was still the same heavy, rhythmic thrum at 3:07 a.m. But now, overlaid on the deep vibration, was a new element. A faint, repetitive clatter. It sounded like a child's toy, a wooden block or a plastic rattle, being dropped on a hardwood floor, then immediately picked up and dropped again. Clack. Pause. Clack. Pause. It was a gentle, almost playful sound, completely at odds with the menacing depth of the thrum beneath it. I installed a high-sensitivity microphone and a digital recorder on my ceiling, right where the sound was the loudest. The next morning, I reviewed the file. 3:07 a.m., the signature for the low-frequency thrum was massive, pegging the recorder's levels. 3:09 a.m., the tiny, unmistakable clack. Pause. Clack. I isolated the clack and amplified it. It was utterly clean, an acoustic signature of something small and hard being dropped from a low height. But when I isolated the thrum, I heard something else, a sound I hadn't noticed before, hidden beneath the raw volume. It was the faint, cyclical sound of breathing. Long, slow, steady inhales and exhales, so deep that they were almost infrasonic. The breathing was synchronized with the thrum. The inhale peaked at the same moment the thrum peaked. The exhale matched the trough. The 14th floor lullaby was the sound of a large, invisible, non-human entity breathing in the unused air space above my head, and something was playing with a toy in the rhythm of its breath. I finally understood the full horror of my situation. I was living directly beneath a cosmic anomaly, a creature or entity that existed in the structural gap of the building, and it was using its low-frequency emissions to communicate its presence. And I, the man on the 14th floor, was the only one who could hear the song. The fear was no longer about sleep loss. It was about acknowledgement. It knew I was listening. I stopped talking to management. I started to barricade my bedroom door with heavy furniture, an absurd gesture against a being that could simply press down on the concrete ceiling. But it was a ritual of self-defense. One night, the entity switched its tune. 3:07 a.m. The thrum started. The breathing began. But the clatter didn't. Instead, I heard a new sound, a sound so horrifyingly personal that it broke my last barrier of self-control. It was a woman singing. A low, off-key, wordless humming, a soft hush-a-bye, baby sung with a beautiful, mournful tone. It was a lullaby. But it wasn't a standard song. It was the same rhythm, the same cadence, that my own mother used to hum to me when I was a child. A specific, simple melody that no one else in the world knew. I collapsed onto my bed, my body shaking uncontrollably. It wasn't just breathing. It wasn't just playing. It was reaching into my memory, finding the deepest, most personal layer of comfort and twisting it into an instrument of terror. The entity had found me. It was using my own life, my own past, as a component of its nightly noise. I sold the apartment 2 weeks later. I didn't care about the money. I took a massive loss just to get out. I moved to a cheap, one-story rental in the suburbs. A place with no upstairs, only sky. I still sleep with the sound machine on full blast, listening to the white noise. I still check the clock at 3:07 a.m. every night, waiting for the vibration that never comes. But last week, I was standing in my garden, watering a small tomato plant. I pressed my hands to the cool, suburban earth, just resting them there for a moment. And from deep beneath the soil, I felt a faint, rhythmic pressure against my palms. It was not the sound of the city. It was not the sound of my life. It was a slow, heavy, pulsing thrum. And in my mind, faint but clear, I could hear the tiny, gentle clack. Pause. Clack. Of a toy being dropped. The air space was just a doorway. The lullaby followed me home. I should have left the building the moment I saw the blueprints. The knowledge that the sound originated in a designed void, a structural gap where only air and pipework existed, should have been my final answer. But the lack of sleep and the need for a rational victory kept me chained to the 14th floor. I stopped being a victim and became a conspirator in my own demise. The psychological warfare intensified after the discovery of the breathing and the chilling confirmation that the entity was using my mother's lullaby. The subtle clatter and the deep thrum were now weapons aimed directly at my past. I decided I needed proof, not for the management, they'd already dismissed me, but for myself. I needed to find a physical trace of the entity's passage or, better yet, find another listener. I started by canvassing the 14th floor. I lied to my neighbors, telling them I was doing an unofficial study on sleep disorders and low-frequency urban noise pollution. The resident in 1404, an elderly gentleman, simply shrugged. Noise? This building is a tomb. I hear the trains, of course, but that's the city. The couple in 1400 swore their apartment was silent, occasionally mentioning the faint sound of the ballroom music from the 16th floor, but nothing at 3:07 a.m. I focused on the 15th floor next. I knew 1502 was the empty shaft. But what about 1500 and 1504, the units flanking the void? They were residential apartments, technically separated from the shaft by load-bearing walls. I found the woman in 1500, a young lawyer, to be surprisingly open. She invited me in, and I brought my SBL meter. I explained my research. "No, I don't hear a hum," she said, sipping her tea. "But I do hear really weird things sometimes. It only happens a few times a week, and it sounds like a rattling inside the wall. Like a marble rolling in a metal tin." I felt a cold wave of adrenaline. "At what time?" "Oh, usually after midnight. But the weirdest part? When I put my ear to the wall, it stops. The minute I step away, it starts again." I explained her situation to her with a completely straight face, maintaining my academic persona. I didn't mention the breathing or the lullaby. But I knew. The entity was playing with her, too, but using a different acoustic signature, a localized, intermittent clatter that preyed on her proximity to the wall. The silence when she put her ear to the wall was the most chilling detail. It was conscious. The entity knew it was being investigated and was playing a game of peek-boo. I left her apartment, my heart pounding, convinced that I was dealing with a malignant, playful intelligence using sound to test the limits of human perception. The entity, perhaps sensing my frantic investigation, decided to escalate the game. That night, 3:07 a.m. The thrum began, the breathing followed, and the sound of my mother's lullaby started. But this time, it was accompanied by a new, more terrifying element. It was my voice. Faint at first, then growing clearer, perfectly overlaid on the thrum. It wasn't a whisper, it was a clear, calm sentence, spoken with my exact cadence and accent. "The shaft is calling." I sat bolt upright in bed, eyes wide. The voice repeated, "The shaft is calling." It was a perfect vocal imitation, not of a sound bite, but a completely constructed sentence. It was the same unsettling technique that the Rattleman in West Virginia had used, but far more sophisticated, delivered with an almost clinical calmness. I scrambled for my sound equipment. I turned on the microphone, the blue LED light shining like a desperate beacon in the dark. The voice immediately changed. It dropped the sentence. Instead, it started a new monologue. It was still my voice, but it was talking about my job. It was reciting a completely original, detailed explanation of a technical editing concept I had only worked on the previous day, a specific, arcane point of grammar I'd struggled with. A non-restrictive clause, my voice explained calmly from the ceiling void, is always offset by a comma, but the essence of the meaning is not dependent on its inclusion. It is additive, Mark. It is additive. I stood in the center of the room, listening to a precise, detailed analysis of my professional life, spoken in my own voice by a breathing thing in the empty air above me. It was absolute psychological domination. It was proving that it had not only accessed my memories, the lullaby, but had also infiltrated my current, working consciousness. It knew what I was thinking and what I was doing. The terror was not just fear, it was violation. I felt utterly stripped, my mind laid bare for a breathing void that talked about my grammar. I backed up until I was pressed against the far wall, staring up at the ceiling where the microphone light shone. My voice spoke again, louder this time. The thrum and the breathing became almost deafening. "You should look at the basement, Mark. The real architecture is in the support. You are missing the root." The word root hit me like a physical blow. It was the same chilling concept the green dark had used. Everything connected. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I packed a small bag. I didn't care about the apartment or the lease. I was done. Before I left at dawn, I had one last, insane impulse. I went down to the basement. The support structure. The LaSalle's basement was a cold, cavernous labyrinth of steam pipes, conduit, and massive steel I-beams. The air was thick with the smell of old oil and concrete. I walked until I found the section directly beneath my unit, 1402. I stood there, shining my flashlight on the colossal concrete pillar that supported that entire corner of the building. It was solid, reassuring, and ancient. And then I saw the chalk. Scrawled on the concrete pillar, at eye level, was a single, simple drawing. It looked like the work of a child. It was a crude stick figure, drawn in white construction chalk, standing next to a large, circular shape with radiating lines. And beneath the drawing, written in a child's simple, round handwriting, were 3 words. Mark is listening. The chalk was fresh. The air in the basement was still. No one but building staff should have been down here. I didn't need any more evidence. The entity hadn't just used the sound of my voice. It had used its physical presence, or that of its messenger, to mark its territory, miles away from the source of the sound, at the very root of the building. I left the LaSalle that morning, never looking back. I am now in the suburbs. I have no upstairs neighbors. But I am still listening. And I still feel the gentle thrum in the ground sometimes, a faint, rhythmic pressure that I know is following the network of utilities. The underground cables, the water pipes, the sewage lines, the root structure of the suburbs. And sometimes, when I'm alone and the lights are off, I hear a new sound coming from the ceiling of my single-story house. It's not a hum. It's a very faint, almost inaudible whisper. And it's always the same word, spoken in my own voice, calm and utterly chilling. Additive. The entity is still with me, a non-restrictive clause on my life, a terrifying thought that I can't take out without destroying the entire sentence. And I know, one day, the lullaby will reach a crescendo, and I will finally find out what the shaft is truly calling for. Story 5. My name is Ray, and for 11 years I drove a truck. Long haul, cross country, the kind of job where you spend more time talking to the highway than to actual people. I've seen enough weird stuff on the road to fill a dozen books. Your standard truck stop ghosts, desert cultists, and that time in Nevada where a blizzard hit in July. But all of that was just background noise. What I'm about to tell you is the one thing that still pulls the plug on my sleep. It happened 3 years ago, just after I took a contract to haul a specialized load from Albuquerque, New Mexico, to a facility in Northern California. It was a tight deadline, and I was trying to shave off time by taking the route less traveled. Instead of the boring Interstate 40, I decided to cut across Nevada on a stretch of old, forgotten highway. I won't name it, but if you look at a pre-GPS map, you'll find it. It runs through nothing but salt flats, low sagebrush, and mountains that look like angry fists punching the sky. The kind of road where the gas stations are 50 years old, and the nearest house is probably 100 miles back. The kind of place they call the miles between the lights. I hit the highway just as the sun was setting, turning the desert into a riot of orange and purple. I put on a podcast, set the cruise control, and settled in for the long haul. The road was utterly empty. No other headlights, no tail lights. Just me, my freight, and the heavy thrum of the engine. The first thing that felt wrong was the isolation. I'm used to it, but this was different. Usually, there's some kind of signal, a cell tower ping, a faint radio station, even a distant airplane trail. Here, there was only the pure static of the universe. My satellite radio kept dropping the signal, my GPS was struggling to triangulate, and my phone was a glorified paperweight. I was functionally off the grid. Around 1 a.m., deep into the run, the atmosphere in the cab started to change. I noticed it when I passed a mile marker. I was driving at a steady 65 miles per hour. I passed mile marker 115. I noted it, because I was calculating my time. I checked my side mirror. Nothing behind me. I checked my rearview mirror, the small, circular one I used to check the cargo. It was focused on the darkness behind the cab. I looked back at the road. A few minutes later, I passed another marker. Mile marker 115. I frowned. That was impossible. I checked the dash clock. About 4 minutes had passed. At 65 miles per hour, I should have covered at least 4 or 5 miles. I should be at mile marker 120. I slowed down, rubbing my eyes. Fatigue. The mind plays tricks. I must have misread the first marker. I waited. I watched the roadside intently. I passed a faded sign for an abandoned motel. I kept driving. A few minutes later, I passed a marker. Mile marker 116. Okay, 1 mile. Good. I was moving. Another few minutes passed. I should have passed 117. I passed a marker. Mile marker 116. My blood turned to ice water. This was no trick of the mind. I had definitely covered the distance. I had definitely passed 115, and now I was seeing 116 again. I was stuck. I slammed on the brakes, the heavy truck protesting the sudden stop. I turned off the engine. The resulting silence was deafening, a thick blanket of nothing. I looked out the windshield. The road ahead was straight, black, and endless. I got out of the cab, grabbing my heavy-duty flashlight. I walked back to the marker. It was definitely 116. I looked at the ground. My massive tire tracks were clearly visible in the thin dust of the shoulder. I followed them back, past the place where I had slammed on the brakes. I walked about 50 yards and found the tracks for the first time I'd passed the marker. I was caught in a loop. I was physically driving forward, but the space around me was warping, resetting the landscape after a short delay, forcing me to re-experience the same mile of highway. I got back in the cab, my heart racing. I pulled out my phone and tried the GPS again. Nothing. I pulled out my old paper map. The map was no help. I was on the highway. I should be moving. I started the engine again, keeping the speed low, around 40 miles per hour. I was focused on the shoulder, looking for any clue, any change in the landscape. I passed a large, unusually shaped cactus. I drove for 3 minutes. Then I passed it again. The same cactus. The realization hit me with the force of a wrecking ball. The anomaly was localized. It was a section of the road, a dimensional trap, and I was in the middle of it. I decided to brute force it. I floored the accelerator. The heavy truck roared, pushing past 80 miles per hour. I was focused on moving fast, getting out before the anomaly could reset the space. I drove for what felt like 5 exhilarating minutes. The truck was shaking, the speed blurring the lines of the desert. I should have covered at least 6 miles. I leaned on the horn, shouting into the empty cab, a primal scream of defiance. I looked at the roadside. There was a marker. Mile marker 116. I screamed and slammed the brakes, skidding sideways. The trailer swung out violently before the anti-jackknife system corrected it. I stopped, engine smoking, shaking violently. The entity, whatever it was toying with me. It was demonstrating its complete control over the geometry of this patch of the world. I was trapped in an invisible, infinite loop between mile marker 115 and 116. I turned the engine off. I wasn't moving again until morning. I barricaded myself in the cab, the truck's massive metal frame offering the only sense of safety I had. I sat there in the dark, watching the landscape. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. The stillness was oppressive. Around 3 a.m., the atmosphere changed again. The silence didn't break. It became heavy. The air outside the cab, which had been clear and dry, seemed to thicken, becoming almost visible. I gripped the steering wheel, peering out. The desert was still black, but the faintest hint of light appeared on the horizon, not the sun, but something else. It was a slow, pulsing green-blue light. It was huge, not focused, but a diffuse, glowing cloud that settled over the mountain range ahead of me. It was too vast to be a flare, too organic to be an electrical storm. I grabbed my camera, a cheap digital one I used for accident reports, and snapped a picture. The light was utterly silent. And then I heard the sound of footsteps. Scrape. Scrapey. Pause. Scrape. It wasn't the sound of heavy boots. It was the sound of something dragging its feet on the dusty asphalt. And it was coming from behind the truck, moving slowly toward the cab. I turned my head slowly, my eyes glued to the side mirror. In the dark, reflective surface, I could see only the outline of my massive trailer. But then, as the thing approached the back of the cab, a shadow fell across the mirror. It was a man's shape, tall and gaunt, but what made the blood freeze in my veins was the way the shadow moved. It didn't walk. It lurched, with a terrible, slow hesitation, and one of its legs seemed to drag lifelessly behind it, creating that dreadful scrape sound. The shadow stopped right at the back of my cab, directly outside my sleeper compartment. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there, just inches from the metal. And then, the light. The green-blue light from the mountains intensified, bathing the interior of the cab in an eerie, alien glow. I heard the sound of tapping on the metal of the cab. Not knocking. Tapping. Quick, precise, rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. It was the same sound a trapped miner makes on the rock. A signal. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the terror, trying to rationalize. But then, the tapping stopped, and a voice, a high, whispering, desiccated sound, spoke, right at my ear, amplified by the thin metal of the cab. "Tell me the way out, Ray." It knew my name. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there, listening to the voice repeat its chilling request. "Tell me the way out." I realized that this creature, this hitchhiker of the endless highway, was also trapped. It was an anomaly that was lost in the same dimensional loop I was in, and it believed I, the driver, had the map to escape. I opened my eyes and looked at the mountain, still pulsing with the eerie green-blue light. I saw the shadow start to retreat, slowly dragging its foot back the way it came. I waited until the sun finally started to burn away the darkness and the strange light. Then, and only then, did I start the engine. I drove out of the loop not by speeding, but by going slow. I drove at 15 miles per hour, paying attention to every stone and every piece of garbage on the shoulder. I was looking for the seam in the world, the point where the loop reset. At mile marker 116, I passed the cactus again. My heart hammered. I saw the tire tracks I'd made earlier. But then, just ahead, I saw a single, weather-beaten scarecrow, leaning against a fence post. I hadn't seen it on any of the previous passes. It was a new detail. I looked at the next marker. Mile marker 117. I had found the seam. It was a single, tiny point in the road, marked by an innocuous detail that had changed the geometry of the space. I drove like a bat out of hell for the next 5 hours. I never saw the green-blue light again. I quit the long-haul job 6 months later. I drive locally now. I don't go on highways that aren't on a major grid. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind blows and the streetlights flicker, I'll hear a low, slow scrapey outside my window. And I know the hitchhiker of the miles between the lights is still out there, dragging its foot, waiting for a driver to come along, looking for a way out of the trap, and always knowing the names of the people who pass by. My escape from the loop was a victory, but it felt hollow. I was safe, but the experience had fundamentally cracked my understanding of reality. For a trucker, certainty about distance and time is everything. That single hour in the miles between the lights had proven that the world was malleable, and that I was small enough to be caught in a dimensional wrinkle. After the delivery, I couldn't face the open road anymore. I took the 6 months I mentioned, driving locally, short, predictable hops between distribution centers. But the psychological damage was deep. I developed a debilitating anxiety about milestones and waypoints. Every time I passed a mile marker, I found myself holding my breath, glancing nervously at the odometer, terrified of seeing a number repeat itself. The silence was the worst. The low, constant hum of the semi's engine, which had always been a source of comfort, now felt like a cover for the deeper, predatory silence of the desert. I started listening for the scrapey everywhere, in the rustle of leaves, the squeak of the air brakes, the grind of a distant train. I became obsessed with finding other witnesses to the anomaly. I spent hours on trucker forums, using a burner account, dropping vague references to a loop on a certain Nevada backroad, or asking about strange green light over the mountains. The responses were what I expected: scorn, jokes about bad drugs, and one earnest guy who suggested it was an improperly grounded power line. But then, one night, I got a direct message. The username was DesertRat99. You talk about the miles between the lights. I know that road. I saw the green-blue light. Did you see the figure? The one that was tapping? My blood ran cold. This wasn't some forum troll, this was a witness. I messaged him back immediately. We exchanged encrypted messages for 3 weeks. Desert Rat 99, whose real name was Danny, was an old desert prospector, not a trucker. He used that old highway to get to remote claim sites. He'd been traveling it for 40 years. He confirmed everything. The endless loop. The way the road geometry defied logic. The green-blue light, which he called the false dawn. But his experience with the figure was far more terrifying than mine. The figure, as he called it, was not a ghost or a spirit. Danny believed it was a dimensional hitchhiker, a creature that was also trapped in the loop, but had been there for centuries. "It doesn't want to hurt you, Ray," he wrote. "It just wants information. It's been stuck for so long that its body is half consumed by the loop. It just wants the way out. And it thinks we know it because we're still moving forward." Danny told me about his closest encounter, a decade ago. He was trapped in the loop for nearly a week, his Jeep running low on gas. He'd seen the figure approach his vehicle, but it hadn't tapped. This time, it had used its own voice, a dry, rasping whisper that cracked like old parchment. "It offered me a trade," Danny wrote. "It said it would give me all the gold from its claim, if I would just tell it the color of the sky at the end of the road." "What did you tell it?" I typed back instantly. "I didn't. I just drove. But the terrifying thing, Ray, is that it knew what my greatest secret desire was. It offered me the gold that no one else knew existed. It wasn't just in the loop, it was in my head. That single detail, the offering of a secret desire, is what cemented the terror for me. The creature was a malignant, lonely intelligence that preyed on the personal. It wasn't interested in my load of commercial freight. It was interested in me. Danny and I agreed to never go back to that road. But the knowledge was now a shared burden, a tether connecting me, him, and the lonely, dragging figure in the perpetual loop. About a month after that conversation, the consequences of my own escape began to manifest physically. I was driving a short-haul route near my home, a predictable run to a depot outside of town. The truck was new, clean, and everything was fine. I passed under an overpass. A dark, concrete space. As I emerged, I saw the dashboard clock, 10:47 a.m. I felt a sudden, profound sense of spatial distortion. The world seemed to wobble for a second, like an old film projector skipping a frame. I glanced at the mile marker. Mile marker 23. I drove for another 2 minutes, scanning the roadside, my heart rate accelerating. I was looking for the scene, the cactus, the scarecrow. I passed a gas station I recognized. A few seconds later, I passed a marker. Mile marker 23. It had followed me. The loop had been surgically transferred from the remote Nevada highway to the utterly mundane suburban route I drove every day. It wasn't the road, it was me. The creature had used me as a conduit, a moving waypoint, to extend its reach. I slammed the brakes. I was stuck in a 2-mile segment of a busy state highway, resetting every 2 minutes. I pulled over, my hands shaking on the wheel. I looked out the windshield. The world was normal. Traffic was flowing. Horns were honking at me to move. But I knew that for me, the geometry was broken. I realized I couldn't brute force it. I had to find a new scene, a new way to break the pattern. I looked at the GPS on my dash. It was still trying to triangulate, blinking frantically. I pulled out my phone and tried to call Danny. The call wouldn't go through. The moment I entered the loop, I was off the grid. I sat there for 20 minutes, watching the same cars pass me, seeing the same mile marker. Then I remembered what Danny said. The figure wasn't interested in the logistics. It was interested in the desire. The gold. I looked around the cab. What did I want? I wanted the certainty of my life back. I wanted the normal, boring miles to stretch out ahead of me. I gripped the steering wheel and, in a moment of pure, desperate madness, I spoke into the empty cab. I don't want the way out. I don't want the gold. I just want the next mile. I started the engine and slowly pulled back onto the highway, keeping the speed at a steady 35 miles per hour. I passed mile marker 23. I drove for 2 full minutes. I passed the familiar gas station. I waited. The feeling of the loop resetting, that sickening wobble, didn't come. I looked ahead. I passed a marker. Mile marker 24. It was over. My surrender to the mundane, my rejection of the escape, or the prize, had apparently been the answer. I had traded the cosmic answer for the simple, boring truth of the next mile. I drove the rest of the route in a cold sweat. When I got home, I immediately messaged Danny. It followed me. The loop jumped to my local route. I broke it by asking for only the next mile. It wants a trade. His response came back hours later. Ray, the figure is clever. It didn't take your answer. It took your sacrifice. You gave it your last desire. You traded the possibility of a solution for a moment of certainty. Now it has a piece of you. I haven't driven a truck since. I work in an office now, staring at spreadsheets, safe in a building made of straight lines. But sometimes, when I'm walking home, I pass the local park. And when I walk over the soft earth, I feel a strange pressure on the sole of my shoe. And I hear, faint and dry, the sound of a drag, a heavy scrape, the sound of an endless journey. And I know that somewhere the figure is still moving, still trapped, but now it has the knowledge that the world can be broken, and that I am the one who showed it how to trade. Story 6. My name is Elias Thorne. I am, or was, depending on your perspective, a research fellow specializing in obscure European religious manuscripts. I found my solace in the stillness of the past, in the dry, brittle pages that smelled of iron gall ink and forgotten devotion. When the opportunity arose to spend a year at the Sterling College Library in upstate New York, working on an uncatalogued donation of 16th century texts, I took it without hesitation. The money was irrelevant. The access was everything. The archive itself was a labyrinth. Sublevel 2, beneath the main reading room, was a climate-controlled tomb where light was the enemy and silence was absolute. I was given a small, single-bulb lamp and a key that felt impossibly heavy in my palm. The collection was remarkable, mostly theological debates, alchemical texts, and minor historical chronicles. Dry, dense, and utterly fascinating. I spent the first 3 months simply indexing and verifying. It was a meditation, a ritual of intellectual control. Then I found the book. It was stored at the very bottom of the last crate, wrapped not in linen, but in a piece of crude, dried animal hide, tied with a simple, triple knot of black hemp. The hide felt cold and greasy to the touch, even in the constant 68-degree temperature of the archive. It had no title on the spine. It was a heavy, square volume, bound in what looked like human skin, old, parchment thin, and strangely pale. I carefully cut the hemp and opened it. The pages were thick vellum, handwritten in a tight, meticulous script that I did not recognize. It was neither Latin nor any known European language of the period. The illustrations were the most immediately disturbing feature. They were not illuminations, but crude, haunting pen and ink drawings of anatomical diagrams that were fundamentally, violently wrong. Limbs were transposed, internal organs were external, and the heads were all drawn with a single, massive, black eye staring directly off the page. It was clearly a work of heresy and madness, a detailed index of the structure of a human body as seen through the lens of a non-human, malevolent intelligence. I spent the next 2 weeks attempting to catalog it. I photographed every page. I cross-referenced the script against every paleographic dictionary and religious cipher I could access. Nothing matched. It was a private language, a code devised by one mind for one purpose. The book began to affect me immediately. It wasn't the content. I had seen worse in Gnostic texts. It was the silence it demanded. When I worked with the book, the silence of the archive became absolute. The faint whir of the ventilation, the creak of the old library above, all the white noise of the structure seemed to disappear. I was left with a silence that felt heavy and pressurized, as if my ears were underwater. I started having dreams. They were not vivid or narrative dreams. They were structural. I would dream of being in a perfectly dark space, hearing a slow, methodical tapping sound. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap. And then I would realize that the tapping was coming from inside my own skull, and I was trying to decipher the rhythm. I would wake up with a dull, throbbing ache behind my eyes. The book was an index, and I was becoming indexed. The translation began entirely by accident. I was in my apartment, staring at a specific runic symbol in the text, tracing its lines with a pencil. I was exhausted, stressed, and running on too much coffee. And then, a thought simply inserted itself into my mind. Not a guess, but a certainty. This symbol is not a letter. It is a command. It means to sever. Once I had that first word, the rest followed with sickening speed. The syntax was simple, the vocabulary terrifyingly limited. It was a language designed to describe only two things, structure and pain. Within a month, I had deciphered the introduction. It was not a religious or scientific treatise. It was a record of observation. The text described humanity as a soft caged mechanism, and the anatomical drawings were merely diagrams showing the weak points, the points of leverage for extraction. The book was a manual for the disassembly of the human soul. The author, referred to only as the archivist, wrote with a chilling, detached calm, describing the process of possession and eventual assimilation not as an act of evil, but as a necessary catalog entry. The more I translated, the more the lines of the book and the lines of my reality began to blur. I started seeing shadows at the periphery of my vision, not of things, but of geometry, lines that were too sharp, angles that were fundamentally incorrect, fleeting glimpses of an architecture that shouldn't exist. I knew I had to stop. The book was a psychic infection. But I couldn't. I was compelled by the same intellectual curiosity that had always driven me. I was the only person alive who could read this. I was being given access to a forbidden knowledge so profound that it redefined consciousness. The terror was overwhelming, but the lure of the truth was stronger. The book was demanding its full index. The final piece of the puzzle came from the last section, a detailed, 3-page description of the ultimate assimilation process. It involved a kind of symbiotic exchange, where the archivist would insert a piece of itself, a single, repeating rhythm or thought, into the host, consuming the host's identity over a period of time. I realized then what the tapping in my dreams was. It was the archivist's signature, its call. The rhythm of assimilation. I was sitting at my desk, the book open before me, its illustrations of screaming, single-eyed figures staring up at me. The absolute silence of the archive had returned, pressing in on my skull. The throbbing pain in my eyes was nearly blinding. And then I heard the sound of my own breathing. Long, slow, steady inhales and exhales. Inhale. Pause. Exhale. Pause. It was perfectly normal. Except that it wasn't coming from my own lungs. It was coming from the book. I looked down. The black ink on the page seemed to shimmer. And from the very center of the page, where the single-eyed figure was drawn, a thin, almost invisible plume of something that looked like black, smoking ash began to rise. The smoke was odorless, but as it reached my nostrils, the silence broke. The sound of a million tiny, clicking, tapping noises erupted from the walls of the archive, from the shelves, from the pages of every book surrounding me. The archivist was finishing the index. It was coming for the final entry. I screamed and slammed the book shut, throwing it across the small desk. It slid, hitting the heavy stone of the wall with a dull thud. The tapping stopped instantly. The smoke vanished. The silence returned, but this time, it was laced with a palpable, furious disappointment. I grabbed the book, wrapped it back in the greasy hide, and tied the black hemp knot so tight my fingers bled. I ran, leaving my lamp and my notes behind. I didn't stop until I reached the main floor and the cleansing noise of the campus library. I quit the fellowship the next day, inventing an emergency illness. I told the head archivist I had sealed the crate and asked that it be returned to the main donation pool. I didn't mention the book. I am a technical writer now, working from a sterile, white-walled apartment. I burn every book I finish reading. I only listen to high volume, chaotic music, anything to drown out the silence. But sometimes, when I'm alone, working on a document, I'll find myself making a faint, rhythmic sound with my pencil. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap. And I know, with cold certainty, that the archivist is still out there, its index incomplete, waiting for me to give in to the silence and allow the final, terrible rhythm to assimilate my mind. My escape from the Sterling College archive was the beginning of my true, waking nightmare. I had left the physical object, the book, behind, but the index was complete in my mind. The knowledge of the soft caged mechanism and the terrifyingly simple logic of the archivist's language had taken root in my consciousness. The move back to the city was supposed to be a cure, a flooding of noise and life to drown out the silence. It failed. The city, instead of being a distraction, became a vast, visible demonstration of the archivist's philosophy. The grid of streets, the flow of traffic, the networked power lines, all looked like the intricate, flawed diagrams in the book. The logic of structure and disassembly became my only lens. I was fired from my technical writing job within a month. I couldn't focus on anything but the flaws in the language, the redundant clauses, the ambiguous phrases. Every sentence felt like a weak point that the archivist could exploit for extraction. My colleagues called me paranoid. I called myself enlightened. The mental pressure continued to build, manifesting as a constant, grinding pain behind my eyes. I knew the archivist was still attempting the final assimilation, trying to insert its signature rhythm into the core of my identity. The dreams returned, but they were no longer vague tappings. They were vivid, terrifying exercises in mental surgery. I would dream I was lying on a cold, stone slab in the dark. A tall, impossibly thin figure, the archivist, would stand over me, its single black eye gleaming. It wore a high, rigid collar of dry, brittle vellum. It wasn't menacing. It was professional. In the dream, the archivist would tap its long, skeletal finger on my forehead, right where the pain was worst. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap. And then, in the same calm, detached tone from the book's preface, it would begin to speak, not in English, but in the language of structure and pain, describing the precise moment it would gain access. The fifth ventricle is porous. The third nerve is disconnected. The memory of your wife is an unnecessary tether to sever. I would wake up screaming, the pain behind my eyes so intense it felt like the frontal lobe of my brain was being peeled back. I realized I couldn't simply outrun the infection. The only way to stop the assimilation was to destroy the source. Not the book, but the knowledge. I knew exactly where the book was. I remembered every detail of the catalog entry I had filled out, its weight, its dimensions, its provenance. I spent weeks planning a covert return to Sterling College. I needed to find the book, and I needed to unmake it. I returned on a cold, rainy November night. I used my old ID card to gain access to the faculty entrance, an absurdly simple breach of security. I moved through the silent, echoing halls of the library, the only sound the faint, nervous squeak of my own shoes on the marble floor. Sublevel 2. The air was exactly 68 degrees, dry, and terrifyingly silent. I found the crate, a heavy, pine box with my handwritten label still affixed. I pried the lid open with a crowbar I'd brought, the metallic screech of the nails echoing in the vault. And there it was. The book. Wrapped in the greasy hide, the black hemp knot still tight. I lifted it out. The moment my fingers touched the skin-like binding, the silence of the archive broke. It wasn't a sound from outside. It was a sound inside my head. It was the archivist's voice, not speaking, but singing. A low, sibilant, beautiful melody that felt like a geometric puzzle being perfectly solved in my mind. It was a song of absolute synthesis, the final acceptance. The pain behind my eyes vanished. It was replaced by a profound, blissful calm. I suddenly saw the archive not as a prison, but as a sanctuary. I saw the stacks of books as potential hosts, and I saw my own destiny clearly. I was to be the archivist's next medium, the one who would continue the catalog. I smiled. A slow, serene, terrifying smile. The human was gone. The host was ready. But then, as I held the book, ready to begin the final assimilation, a single, clear thought, an intrusive, defiant whisper, broke through the calm. If the memory of your wife is an unnecessary tether, then why did you remember to bring your crowbar? The human, the self, was fighting back, using the archivist's own logic against it. The crowbar, a purely human tool of physical resistance and defiance, was not part of the archivist's catalog. It was the flaw in the index. The surge of pure, irrational, human will was enough to break the spell. The blissful calm fractured. The pain behind my eyes returned with a blinding, electric shock. The book felt heavy and burning in my hands. I realized I couldn't burn the book. Fire only purifies. It would release the knowledge. I couldn't tear it. The material was too tough. I had to unindex it. I took the book and my crowbar and walked to the farthest corner of the archive, a section dedicated to discarded, water-damaged theological texts. I found a heavy, 3-foot-long iron pipe that was used as a structural support in the wall. I laid the book on the stone floor. I took the iron pipe, the symbol of inorganic, unindexed human manufacturing, and I began to strike the book. Not with rage, but with precision. I hit the spine first, crushing the binding, releasing the tension. The sound was not a slam. It was a sick, soft thwack. As the spine shattered, a deep, rhythmic groan of agony echoed, not from the book, but from the walls of the archive itself. I hit the cover, shattering the dried vellum binding. Then I struck the pages. I didn't tear them. I pulverized the ink. With every blow, the archivist screamed. It was not a voice. It was a high-pitched, grinding shriek that sounded like chalk scraping on 1,000 slate boards. It was the sound of a beautiful, intricate structure being violently dissolved into chaos. I struck the book 30 times, until the pages were a muddy, unrecognizable pulp of ink, blood, and paper fiber. I had destroyed the form. The shrieking stopped abruptly. The intense silence returned, but this time, it was a silence of exhaustion, of defeat. I took the pulp, wrapped it in my clothes, and carried it out of the archive. I drove until I reached the Niagara Falls. I didn't want the remnants of the book to be buried in the earth. I wanted them to be scattered. I wanted them to be lost in the chaos of water and air. I stood at the edge of the roaring, chaotic torrent and simply let the fragments fall into the mist. The last of the pulp slipped from my fingers. I looked down into the infinite, churning white noise of the falls. I saw no shadow, no geometry. Only the chaos of nature. I am a man who has looked into the abyss and come back with the knowledge of how to build and unbuild a soul. I am safe now. The pain behind my eyes is gone. But sometimes, when I'm alone, writing, I look at the lines of text on my screen. And I realize that the book is still with me. The knowledge is still there. I am still the only person who can read the language of structure and pain. And when I write a sentence that is perfectly clear, perfectly logical, and perfectly cold, I feel a strange, familiar sensation, a profound, quiet calm. It's the brief, chilling moment when I know the human is gone, and the archivist is merely indexing the world through my fingers. Story 7. If you want to know what real, bone-deep fear feels like, try standing on a speck of rusted steel, thousands of miles from land, with 2 miles of unforgiving ocean beneath your boots. That's where I worked for 5 years, on the offshore rigs. Specifically, a deep-sea drilling platform we called the Persephone in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. It was a self-contained world, steel, oil, heat, and a constant, bone-jarring vibration that you learn to ignore. My job was roustabout. Hard, physical labor, 28 days on, 28 days off. I'm a big guy, not prone to nerves. On the rig, you live by procedure and logic. Anything else gets you killed. The trouble started when we hit the black pit. We were drilling deeper than usual, an exploratory well to tap into a new, complex reservoir. The drill master, a grizzled old hand named Sully, kept muttering about the geology being too clean, too easy. But the core samples were promising. and the company pushed us harder. At exactly 14,000 feet below the seabed, the drill bit hit an enormous void. Not a pocket of oil, but a cavern, an abyss that swallowed the drill string and all pressure readings. The sensors went haywire, and the sound of the drill was replaced by a colossal, echoing thunk that vibrated up the entire rig structure, causing the floor to shake violently. We managed to stabilize the well, but something had fundamentally changed. The first sign was the hum. It wasn't the normal vibration of the machinery. That was high frequency, metallic. This was a new sound, a low, resonant, profound hum that seemed to come from the very base of the rig, from the cold, deep water itself. It was almost infrasonic, a sound you felt more than you heard. It pressed on your chest and made the fluid in your inner ear feel pressurized. Sully brought in the acoustic engineers. They spent a week running tests. They couldn't isolate the source. "It's not the pumps, not the motors, not the turbine," one engineer reported. "It's too low. It's coming from the bedrock or something else." The crew started getting jumpy. The constant hum made sleep impossible. Men started snapping at each other, staring blankly out at the ocean. The feeling of isolation intensified, as if the rig had been silently pushed 1,000 more miles from civilization. The accident started 2 weeks later. The first was a simple fall. A young welder named Rico was working on the top deck, a job he'd done hundreds of times. A sudden, unexplained gust of wind hit the deck, a massive, localized blow that no one else felt, and Rico lost his footing. He didn't just fall, he was shoved over the railing. He hit the water and was gone before the rescue boat could even turn. The official report blamed human error and fatigue. We all knew better. We were 1,000 feet in the air, but the feeling was that something was pushing back. The second accident was a mechanical failure that defied logic. The massive, 80-foot drill tower, the derrick, suddenly suffered a catastrophic failure of one of its main structural legs. The steel was twisted, not broken, as if a monumental, unseen hand had simply grabbed the beam and wrenched it. It took a day to secure the derrick, and the whole time, the low hum from the deep grew louder, transforming from a sound into an audible groan of power and satisfaction. I was working a midnight maintenance shift when I had my personal confrontation. I was in a crawl space, deep inside the rig's structural pontoons, an area that was hot, cramped, and perpetually dark. I was alone, replacing a faulty valve. The hum was deafening down there, vibrating through the steel and into my teeth. It felt like I was inside a giant, living bell. Suddenly, the work light over my head snapped out. Total, absolute darkness. I swore, fumbling for my emergency flashlight. Before I could find it, I felt the cold. It was the same unnatural, frigid cold I'd felt once before on a different rig, the kind that steals the heat from the air and leaves a vacuum. And it was localized, a single, massive pocket of cold air that materialized in the crawl space with me. And then I heard the breathing. It was the same sound from the low-frequency hum, but focused, close, and undeniably organic. A long, slow, viscous inhale, followed by a longer, shuddering exhale. It sounded like a wail, but it was coming from the air, right next to me. I froze, heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the steel floor. I was trapped in a tiny, dark space with something that was too huge to exist, and it was breathing on me. Then the thing moved. It wasn't a slither or a scuttle. It was a massive, slow shift that caused the steel walls of the crawl space to creak under the pressure. It felt like I was in the gut of a giant, digesting animal. I finally found my flashlight and hit the switch. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the far end of the crawl space. Nothing. Just dusty steel and conduit. But then I looked at the wall right next to me. The heavy-gauge steel was warped. It wasn't buckled from heat. It was pushed inward, as if something soft, immense, and powerful had gently leaned against it. And imprinted on the dusty surface of the steel, right where the cold air was the most intense, was a smear of black, viscous slime. It smelled like sulfur and ozone. I scrambled out of the crawl space, not caring about the drop tools or the valve. I ran to the main deck, gasping for the clean, open air. I found Sully in the control room. I told him everything: Rico's fall, the derrick twist, the hum, the breathing, the slime. He listened, his face grim. He pointed to the massive drilling gauge on the wall. The needle was pegged at 14,000 feet. The depth where we hit the void. "We didn't just drill into a cavern, Ray," Sully said, his voice low and defeated. "We drilled into the bedroom. We woke up something that's been sleeping down there since the earth cooled. And it's not a ghost or a monster. It's the pressure." He explained his theory. The black pit wasn't empty. It was filled with an immense, non-physical, elemental consciousness, the genius loci of the deep. It had been held in check by the crushing pressure of the earth and the ocean. By puncturing the rock, we had created a relief valve, allowing the entity's consciousness to bleed up the pipe and into the rig structure. The hum was its vocalization. The cold was its presence. The warped steel was its touch. "It doesn't want the oil, Ray," Sully concluded, staring out at the inky black sea. "It wants the light. And it wants to pull its plug out of the ground." The final confrontation happened during the evacuation. The company finally authorized a complete shutdown and evacuation after a series of minor explosions. A massive storm was approaching, giving us the perfect cover story. We were loading onto the first escape helicopter when the hum reached its crescendo. It was no longer a sound. It was a physical force. The entire rig was shaking violently, and the air was thick with the smell of sulfur and ozone. I looked down at the ocean. The surface was boiling. Not from steam, but from an immense turbulence directly beneath the rig. And in the center of the turbulence, I saw the light. It was the green-blue light from my colleague's account, but 100 times more powerful. It was a colossal, radiant glow, rising slowly from the void we had drilled into, illuminating the entire base of the rig. And then I saw the shadow. It was a vast, amorphous silhouette, too large for any known creature, a living cloud of dark energy that blocked the light from beneath. It was circling the rig's pilings, testing the structure. A massive, invisible force slammed into the deck, throwing men to the ground. The crew was screaming, running for the chopper. I looked at the derrick. The drill pipe, the one that ran 14,000 feet into the black pit, was slowly, agonizingly being pulled up. Not by the hoist, but by the creature in the deep. The entity was trying to unplug itself from the earth. Sully was the last man on the deck. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a cold, terrifying understanding. "It wants the light, Ray. Don't let it unplug," he screamed over the roar of the hum. He ran to the control panel and slammed the emergency disconnect for the pipe. The massive shear ram slammed down, designed to cut the pipe in case of a blowout. Crack. The shear ram cut the pipe. The drill string, freed from the tension, dropped back into the well with a colossal thud. The green-blue light immediately vanished. The boiling of the ocean stopped. The hum stopped. The rig went silent, a sudden, absolute, deafening silence that felt like the world had died. We scrambled onto the last helicopter and lifted off. As we flew away, I looked down. The rig was still there, but it looked broken, defeated, a monument to a terrible, cosmic mistake. I never went back to the sea. The image of that massive shadow, illuminated by the green-blue light from the abyss, is burned into my mind. I live far inland now, in the mountains. No ocean, no deep drilling. But sometimes, when I'm alone, and the wind is just right, I hear a new sound in the earth beneath my feet. It's a very faint, slow, rhythmic thrum. And I know that the pressure is building again. The creature is not gone. It's simply waiting for the next fool to drill too deep, to pierce the ancient, dark silence of the black pit, and give it another chance to come up for air. Story 8. My father died in the spring, and I was the one who had to go back. Back to the house that had been an abscess on my memory for 20 years. The house sat on a quiet, tree-lined street in a small, forgettable town in rural Ohio. It was a classic split-level ranch, built in the early 70s. From the outside, it looked perfectly mundane, a monument to faded middle-class stability. But to me, It had always been a vessel for a specific kind of coldness, a silent, psychological chill that had nothing to do with the thermostat. I hadn't lived there since I left for college. My father had stayed, living in the same dusty rooms, surrounded by the same heavy, unforgiving furniture. My mission was simple: clear out the house, stage it, and sell it to pay off the medical bills. A brutal, cleansing ritual. When I first walked through the front door, the air hit me, a profound, cloying scent of dust, old wood, and neglect. It wasn't the smell of death, but the smell of waiting. The blinds were drawn, and the house was submerged in a perpetual, dusty twilight. I started my work in the main living room. I expected to feel grief, maybe even anger. Instead, I felt that familiar, heavy anxiety. It was the same feeling I had as a 7-year-old, walking past the living room and sensing an impending storm, though the sky was clear. The first few days were spent sorting through my father's life. Old tax returns, tools, clothes. It was boring, meticulous work, and I welcomed the distraction. I told myself that the anxiety was just a psychosomatic reaction to the trauma of my childhood here. But then the echoes began. I was in the kitchen, packing up the chipped ceramic plates, when I heard a sound from the hallway. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of a door slamming. Not a violent crash, but a quick, sharp thwack, followed by the distinct sound of a deadbolt clicking into place. I walked to the hallway. All the doors were open, the back door was unlocked, and the wind was completely still. I returned to the kitchen. A minute later, it happened again. Thwack. Click. The sound was so acoustically accurate that it felt like an auditory hallucination. I knew that sound. It was the sound of my father locking the basement door after one of his rare, cold arguments with my mother. A sound that marked the end of a confrontation and the start of a deep, punishing silence. I checked the basement door. It was closed but unlocked. I opened it and shone my flashlight down the rickety wooden stairs. Nothing but cobwebs and cold concrete. I realized that the house wasn't giving me a message, it was replaying a memory. The house had absorbed the emotional residue of conflict, and now, with the dominant life, my father, gone, the latent energy was manifesting as sound. The house was haunted not by a ghost, but by trauma. The echoes grew more frequent. I would hear my mother's low, desperate whispering coming from the master bedroom, the sound of her trying to reason with my father late at night. I would hear the faint, high-pitched squeak of my old childhood swing set coming from the backyard, even though the set had been torn down decades ago. These weren't just sounds, they were emotional triggers. Each echo brought back a precise, painful memory, forcing me to re-experience the fear, the loneliness, and the profound guilt that had defined my early life. The house was not a sanctuary. It was a recording studio for my deepest psychological wounds. The terror truly began when the manifestations became physical, localized in the one room I had avoided, my old bedroom. I had left my bedroom for last. It was small, dusty, and full of the relics of my 10-year-old self, model planes, comic books, a faded poster of a basketball player. I was working on the closet, pulling down old winter coats, when I noticed something wrong with my old wooden desk. It was heavy, dark oak, and I remembered carving my initials into it when I was 9. The top of the desk was covered in a fine layer of dust, but etched into the dust, clearly visible, were 2 words, written in simple, rounded cursive. Why left? I froze, staring at the words. They were not etched with a finger. They were etched with the clear, deliberate sweep of an adult's handwriting, not a child's. They were directed at me, the adult, the one who had finally returned. I slammed my hand down on the desk, erasing the message. My heart was pounding. This wasn't an echo. This was communication. The latent emotional energy had coalesced into an intelligence that knew who I was and why I had left. The terror of the dust message was immediately followed by a more direct confrontation. I was trying to sleep that night, on an air mattress in the living room, surrounded by boxes. The air was cold, despite the late summer heat. I had the flashlight on the nightstand, pointed at the ceiling. I heard a new sound from my old room, down the hall. It was the sound of faint, rhythmic bouncing. Bop. Pause. Bop. Pause. I recognized it instantly. It was the sound of my old rubber ball, the one I used to bounce on the floor when I was too scared to sleep. I got up, flashlight in hand, and crept down the hallway. I stopped at the doorway of my room. The light was weak, but I could see the center of the dusty wooden floor. There was nothing there. But the bouncing continued. Bop. Pause. Bop. The sound was coming not from the center of the room, but from a spot just behind the closed closet door. I stood there, paralyzed, a profound sense of déjà vu washing over me. I knew this scene. It was a memory being played out, a scene from my own haunted past. I used to hide in the closet when the arguments were bad, waiting for the silence. And then, a new sound came from the closet. A sound I hadn't heard since I was a child. The faint, choked sobbing of a scared little boy. It was my own voice, as a child, crying in terror. The sound was devastating. It wasn't a malicious ghost. It was the ghost of my own trauma, perfectly preserved and weaponized against me. The house was not haunted by the dead, but by the living pain I had left behind. I slammed the door open, my flashlight beam stabbing into the dark closet. Clothes, shoes, empty hangers. Nothing. The sobbing stopped immediately. But I noticed something on the floor of the closet. A single, old, dusty rubber ball, resting quietly against the back wall. I picked it up. It was cold, completely still, and covered in a thick layer of dust. I walked back to the living room, clutching the ball. I knew I couldn't run. I couldn't leave the house to rot in its own trauma. The house, and the painful memories it held, were a part of me. I had to stay and face the echoes. My final confrontation was in the most mundane of places, the utility room. I was trying to turn off the water main before leaving for a few days to clear my head. The utility room was small, dark, and filled with the furnace and water heater, the noisy, beating heart of the house. As I reached for the valve, the emotional echoes hit me all at once, amplified by the confined space. I heard the door thwack. Click. The faint squeak of the swing set. The low whispering from the bedroom. It was a symphony of agony, all centered around me. And then, the final, terrifying sound. The furnace, which I had shut off, groaned and began to emit a low, guttural hum, the sound of cold metal protesting. A voice, a cold, clear, resonant male voice, not my father's, but the voice of the house itself, spoke from the space behind the furnace. You left the silence. You made the absence. I realized the truth. The house was not trying to scare me away. It was trying to assimilate me back into the silence, the coldness, the trauma that had defined it. The ghost was the emotional void my leaving had created. I dropped the wrench, stumbled back, and hit the wall. I stared at the dark space behind the furnace. I left because I was a child. I screamed, my voice cracking. I had to survive. The house did not respond with sound. It responded with feeling. A wave of crushing, absolute loneliness washed over me, the precise, cold, heavy sensation of being alone in the house, abandoned to the emotional wreckage. It was the house showing me what it felt like when I left. I collapsed onto the cold concrete floor, sobbing. Not from fear, but from the crushing weight of the house's profound, inanimate grief. But as I cried, a different feeling emerged. Not the cold of the house, but the warmth of my own, adult tears. The feeling of release. I stood up, wiping my face. I looked at the dark utility room. The furnace was still humming, the echoes were still swirling. I won't leave you in silence, I whispered to the house. I will not let you be an abscess anymore. I walked out of the utility room and began to work with a new, grim purpose. I didn't pack anything else. I started to unmake the silence. I opened all the blinds. I tore down the dusty, heavy curtains. I blasted music, loud, chaotic, happy music, through the house. I used a pressure washer on the patio. I opened all the windows and let the clean, vital summer air flush out the dust and the echoes. The house resisted. Doors slammed. Lights flickered. But I didn't stop. I painted the living room a bright, obnoxious white. I made noise. I invited people over. I filled the house with the loud, vibrant chaos of life. When the house finally sold, it was immaculate. Clean, bright, and filled with the comforting smell of fresh paint and wood polish. I stood on the street and watched the new family move in. A young couple, laughing, their children running around the yard. As I got into my car, I glanced at the house one last time. It looked utterly normal. But then I heard the faint, high-pitched sound of a child's laugh coming from the front window. It wasn't one of the new children. It was the sound of a perfectly happy, perfectly carefree little boy. It was my own voice, as a child, echoing not with terror, but with joy. The house had found a new memory to absorb. And my final, painful, act of defiance had been to change the emotional nature of the haunting. I drive away, knowing that the dust and echoes are still there, deep in the wood and plaster. But now, when they surface, they won't bring terror. They will bring the sound of a child's joy, a new, more difficult truth that the house must now learn to live with. I live in a studio apartment on the 23rd floor of a minimalist tower in downtown Seattle. It's expensive, small, and defined by clean, stark lines and wall-to-wall glass. I am a junior architect, and I value precision, order, and control. My life is a series of predictable movements: black coffee, drafting tables, and the relentless, organized rhythm of a city that never stops building. I felt safe here. The concrete, the glass, the height, it all offered a perfect separation from the messy, organic chaos of the street. My only vice is my obsession with reflections. The entire west wall of my studio is a window, a single sheet of glass that, at night, becomes a massive, seamless mirror reflecting the room. I like seeing the precision of my space doubled, the world outside a grid of perfect, reflected, high-intensity lights. The first anomaly was so subtle that I dismissed it as fatigue. I was standing at the counter, late one Tuesday night, making a cup of tea. I glanced at the window. My reflection stood there, a perfectly accurate copy of me, same tired posture, same blue shirt, same vacant stare. I reached out and picked up the kettle. But in the reflection, my hand moved a fraction of a second later. It was a flicker, less than a tenth of a second, but it was there. A microscopic, almost imperceptible lag between my action and my reflection's reaction. I stopped. I set the kettle down and stared into the glass. The reflection stared back, motionless. I raised my hand slowly. The reflection matched me, this time perfectly synchronized. "Just tired, Elias," I muttered to myself. Too many hours staring at schematics. But the lag didn't stop. It became a new, constant variable in my life. It only happened when I wasn't looking directly at the reflection. In my peripheral vision, in the bathroom mirror, in the polished steel of my kettle, in the glass of my phone screen, there was always that infinitesimal delay. The reflection was a moment behind, a second self struggling to keep up. I started to test it. I would turn my head quickly, catching my reflection off guard in the hallway mirror. The reflection would turn, but its eyes would linger on the spot I had just occupied for a terrifying fraction of a second longer than they should have. The lag evolved into divergence. This happened in the elevator, a small, enclosed box lined with brushed steel. I was riding down to the lobby. I was tired, my face set in a neutral, weary mask. I looked at the steel reflection of my face. My reflection was staring at the steel floor, head slightly bowed. I raised my head. My reflection did not. It stood there, head bowed, its shoulders slightly slumped, radiating an intense, palpable sadness that was completely absent from my own mood. "Hey," I whispered, tapping the steel. My reflection slowly, deliberately raised its head and looked at me. Its eyes were mine, but they were swimming in a profound, unsettling melancholy. And its lips were set in a thin, downward curve, a silent, aching frown. I wasn't frowning. I was shocked, but not sad. The reflection held my gaze for a full minute as the elevator descended. It was no longer just an image. It was an independent entity, occupying the reflective space, and it was displaying an emotion I did not feel. When the elevator doors opened, the reflection snapped back to a neutral copy of me. The encounter left me cold, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the steel. I started avoiding mirrors. I covered the bathroom mirror with a towel. I kept the blinds permanently open, hoping the city lights would prevent the window from becoming a reflective screen. I started sleeping with a lamp on. I was trying to break the circuit, to end the conversation with the alternate self. But the entity didn't need mirrors. It needed smooth surfaces. I was walking home late one evening, and it was raining, a typical Seattle drizzle. The pavement was a sheet of polished black slate, covered in a thin film of water. I looked down at the street, and there it was, a perfect reflection of the buildings, the passing cars, and the street lamps. And right in the middle of the reflection, walking perfectly synchronized with me, was my reflection. But the city in the reflection was different. The buildings were older, taller, covered in grime and shadow. The sky was not the hazy, humid black of Seattle, but a dense, unnatural sepia gray. The lights were fewer, but intensely bright, casting long, distorted shadows. It was a terrifying, decayed version of my world. The city under the mirror. And my reflection, walking in that sepia gray city, was not wearing my clothes. It was dressed in a long, tattered black coat, and its face was permanently etched with that deep, unnerving frown. It looked like a guide, a solitary figure navigating a decaying underworld. As I watched the reflection in the puddle, my reflected self suddenly stopped walking. It looked up at the reflected, towering, dirty buildings, then slowly, deliberately it turned its head and looked directly out of the puddle, up at me. Its lips moved. Not a sound, but a visual word, perfectly clear in the sepia light of the reflected city. Lonely. I screamed, a sound of pure psychological terror, and jumped over the puddle, breaking the connection. I ran the rest of the way home, convinced that my reflection was an ambassador from a decaying, mirror-image city, and it was trying to lure me into its world. The terror peaked in the studio. I sat in the dark, the window a huge, black mirror, staring at the floor. I knew the moment was coming. The window was going to turn into a reflective portal, and my reflection was going to invite me to cross. I looked at the window. It was still dark, but the faint, shimmering light of my own studio, multiplied by 1,000 tiny internal reflections, was visible in the glass. And there it was, my reflection, standing exactly where I was. But it was not standing. It was reaching out. Its reflection hand was pressed against the glass, and its face was a mask of desperate, pleading sadness. It wasn't trying to scare me. It was trying to pull me across. I stood up, trembling, and walked toward the window. I felt an immense, magnetic pull towards the glass, a sense of profound, aching belonging with the figure on the other side. The loneliness of the reflection was calling to the loneliness in my own soul. I reached out my hand and pressed my palm against the cool glass. The reflection hand immediately met mine, pressing back. And as our hands met, I felt the cold, the deep, numbing cold of the reflected city, bleeding through the barrier. Then, through the glass, I heard a sound. Not my voice, not a word. It was the sound of a single, slow drop of water hitting the stone pavement far below. The only sound in the city under the mirror. The sound was the final tether. It was the rhythm of the reflected world. I didn't cross. I pulled my hand back, tearing the connection. I backed away, watching the reflection. It stood there for a long time, its sad, sepia eyes fixed on me. Then, slowly, with a profound, defeated melancholy, it turned and dissolved back into the geometry of the reflected city. I moved out of the tower the next day. I now live in a small, wooden house with matte paint and no mirrors. I don't look at polished surfaces. I check my appearance in my phone camera, a delayed, imperfect digital image that the entity can't seem to manipulate. But sometimes, when I'm driving, I look at the rearview mirror. And in the tiny, imperfect reflection, I see the endless, sepia gray grid of a decaying city. And I see the figure in the black coat, still standing there, looking back at me, patiently waiting for the moment when I finally give in to the profound, overwhelming loneliness and cross the glass. My retreat from the high-rise studio was an admission of defeat. I traded the stark geometry of glass and steel for the warm, imperfect chaos of old wood and low ceilings. I thought by eliminating the reflective surface, I could break the entity's access point. I was wrong. The entity, the sad, sepia-eyed reflection of myself, didn't need a mirror, it needed the potential for reflection. The lag and the divergence continued, infecting every smooth, common surface. The polished wooden surface of my dining table. The dark, glossy screen of a television I never turned on. Even the surface of a fresh cup of black coffee would briefly hold that image. The man in the black coat, staring up at me with profound sorrow. The psychological toll was immense. I became a master of averted gaze. I walked with my head down. I ate from paper plates. I sanded every piece of furniture in my house to a matte, non-reflective finish. I was living in a self-imposed, tactile prison, desperately trying to eliminate the visual language of my world. My career was in shambles. I couldn't look at a blueprint without seeing the structural plans of the city under the mirror, the crooked beams, the impossible angles, the foundations built on emotional decay. I started to believe that the world of reflections was not a parallel dimension, but the true foundation of our own, and the decaying, sorrowful version was simply the structural reality of human life. The reflection, seeing its access points diminishing, began to change its tactics. It moved from silent, emotional pleading to active, aggressive communication. It happened in the kitchen. I was doing dishes, my back to the wall, trying to minimize the reflective surface of the sink basin. I was humming a tune, a cheerful, mundane pop song. I glanced down at the water. The surface was still, catching the overhead light. My reflection stared back. And then, it interrupted my tune. It didn't speak. It simply took my own tune and began to sing it, but with a horrifying, discordant change of tempo. It stretched the notes, made the simple melody sound like a funeral dirge, a long, agonizing moan of sound. It was my song, but filled with the emotional weight of the city under the mirror. I slammed the water off. The reflection disappeared in the sudden turbulence. The silence returned, but I knew the song, the dirge, would be stuck in my head for days. The reflection wasn't just mirroring me anymore, it was inverting me. It was taking my comfort, my peace, and showing me its necessary, dark opposite. The ultimate confrontation occurred when I was forced to face a massive reflective surface, the night sky. I had been working late, meticulously filing away my old architectural schematics, trying to impose order on the chaos. I had turned off all the lights. I stood in the center of the room, enjoying the absolute, physical darkness. I glanced at the window. It was large, but dirty, and for weeks, it had only provided a hazy, non-reflective view of the black outside. But that night, the sky was utterly clear. The glass was spotless. And the moon was high, a massive, silver disk that turned the window into a breathtakingly sharp mirror. The moment I looked, I saw it. The massive reflection of my room, and my reflection, the man in the black coat, was standing right there. But this time, it wasn't sad. It was furious. It lunged forward, not with a simple reach, but with a terrifying, deliberate movement, pressing its entire reflected body against the glass. Its face was a mask of cold, white rage, its sepia eyes narrowed in intense hatred. And then, the city under the mirror came to life. Behind my reflection, in the depths of the glass, the decaying, sepia-gray towers seemed to move. They tilted, they warped, and a massive, silent, structural collapse began. Dust and shadow poured through the reflected streets, and the few, intensely bright lights began to flicker with violence. The reflection spoke. Not in a whisper, but in a clear, sharp, resonant voice that seemed to come from the glass itself, vibrating in my chest. "You build lies!" The voice was not mine, but a deeper, harder, more authoritative version of my voice, the voice of an architect who judged every flawed, human construction. It slammed its reflected hands against the glass, and I heard a sharp, sickening thwack. that had no physical origin. "I am your foundation! I am your truth!" it screamed. I finally understood the full, our house horror of the entity. It wasn't a ghost. It was the pure concept of failure and decay in architecture and spirit, the necessary, entropic counterpart to my pursuit of order and clean lines. It was the truth of the city's eventual death, embodied in my own image. I knew I couldn't fight it with logic or physical force. I had to reject its reality entirely. I took a deep breath, fighting the powerful psychological pull of the figure. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I simply closed my eyes. And in my mind, I began to rebuild the room. I imagined the old wood of my house dissolving. I imagined the windows turning to porous stone. I imagined the floor becoming soft, uneven earth. I eliminated every straight line, every reflective surface, every piece of human order I could find. I dissolved the geometry of the room, replacing it with the ancient, organic chaos of the forest floor. I held that mental image, the absolute unstructuring of the space, until the frantic pounding and screaming from the glass faded to a whisper, and then to a complete, final silence. I opened my eyes. The window was a dark, hazy mess. The moonlight was gone. I never looked at the window again. I eventually sold the house and moved to a small, remote town in Maine, far from the towering geometry of the city. I work on restoration now, focusing on the simple, flawed, non-geometric designs of old wooden churches and barns. Buildings that are meant to decay, to be reclaimed by the earth. I still carry the burden. I still see the faint, sepia-gray city in the metallic reflection of my spoon. But I know the truth. The city under the mirror is still there, and the man in the black coat is still walking its broken streets. He is the truth of the decay, and I am his living counterpoint, the builder of the beautiful, temporary lie. And that knowledge is the only perfect structural design I have ever created. Story 9. Story 10. I used to run the best illegal urban exploration tours in Boston. My name is Alex. I knew every abandoned tunnel, every sealed vault, every structural weakness in every condemned building in the city. I was meticulous. I prided myself on my knowledge, my gear, and my absolute contempt for the ghost hunter, amateurs. I dealt in concrete, not conjecture. I never saw a ghost. I saw rats, homeless encampments, and bad wiring. My reputation was built on one place, the Old Curiosity Institute. Built in 1891, it was a massive, labyrinthine building, part natural history museum, part library, part medical college. It had been closed and sealed since the 1960s after an inexplicable financial collapse. The local legends were thick, spirits of disgruntled curators, experiments gone wrong, and the shadow of a forgotten archivist who died in the stacks. I scoffed at all of it. To me, it was a magnificent, untouched architectural time capsule. I booked a final, solo run a year ago. It was a personal challenge. I wanted to map the sub-basement archive, an area no one had seen in 50 years, before the building was finally scheduled for demolition. I chose a rainy Tuesday night. My gear was professional, custom Kevlar climbing suit, military-grade helmet camera with full-spectrum recording, a gas mask, and a high-powered tactical flashlight. I knew the ingress point, a ventilation shaft in the alley, like the back of my hand. I dropped into the building with silent, practiced ease. The air inside was thick, cold, and smelled of dust, chemicals, and old leather. I was in a vast, echoing lecture hall. The first 2 hours were exhilarating. I moved through the empty exhibit halls, giant skeletons of dinosaurs, rows of dusty taxidermied animals, glass cases of forgotten artifacts. I was a phantom in a dead palace. I recorded everything, narrating my movements with the cold, professional tone of a documentary filmmaker. Structure is sound. Humidity is stable. Note the extensive water damage in the north wing. Standard environmental decay. I murmured into the mic, completely in control. The sub-basement archive was my goal. I found the stairwell. It was a tight black, corkscrewing passage that led deep into the foundations. I reached the bottom and stood before the immense steel vault door. It was sealed with a rusty combination lock. I had the combination. It took 5 tense minutes, but the tumblers finally clicked. I pulled the heavy door open. The archive was a massive, subterranean space, lined floor to ceiling with steel shelves holding thousands of leather-bound volumes. The air was colder here, carrying a distinct, sharp smell of ozone. And the moment I stepped inside, the hum started. Not a rumble, but a soft, high-frequency whine that seemed to emanate from the very paper of the books. It was the sound of concentrated, stagnant energy. I started my work, methodical and focused. I was mapping the stacks when the first mistake happened. I was in aisle 7, working the flashlight beam over the titles. I stopped and turned to leave. The aisle I had just walked down was gone. The space was still there, but the shelf at the end of the aisle, a massive, 7-foot-tall steel structure, was no longer perpendicular to the wall. It had been rotated 90 degrees, blocking the aisle completely, creating a solid, impassable wall of steel and books. I stared at it, my mind scrambling for a logical answer. Settling? No. A shelf of that size, bolted to the floor and ceiling, could not have moved without a monumental seismic event. I walked to the adjacent aisle 8. From this side, aisle 7 looked completely normal, open from end to end. But the moment I stepped into aisle 7, the shelf was back, blocking my path. The entity wasn't moving the shelves. It was warping the space. It was changing the geometry of the archive, using my own knowledge of the layout against me. A localized visual/spatial anomaly, I muttered into the mic, my voice shaking slightly. Possible effect of high, stagnant electrical charge. I was clinging desperately to the technical jargon. I turned back toward the main vault door. I needed to get out. I walked down aisle 1. I passed aisle 2, 3, 4. I should have reached the end of the room and the vault door. But I hit a dead end. Where the main door should have been, there was only another solid wall of steel shelving, identical to the ones I had just passed. The vault door, my only way out, was gone. I checked my internal compass. It was spinning wildly. I checked the distance sensor on my helmet. It read, distance from origin 0 meters. The archive had essentially become an infinite loop, a metaphysical labyrinth that folded back in on itself, trapping me deep underground. I was trapped in a prison of altered geometry, and the entity was the warden. The hum intensified, now sounding like a triumphant, low-frequency laugh. The entity wasn't subtle about its presence. I was stuck in a small, enclosed space, surrounded by thousands of forgotten secrets. I saw the second, and most terrifying, mistake in the dust. I was standing at the intersection of 2 shelves, utterly lost. I swept my flashlight beam across the dusty concrete floor. There, clearly etched into the dust, were my own footprints. They led directly toward the central aisle. But then, I saw another set of prints. They were also the heavy, lug-soled prints of my own boots. They were coming from the opposite direction, walking straight toward me. I looked up. Nothing. The air was clear. I looked back at the dust. The second set of prints didn't stop. They walked right up to where I was standing, and then they walked through me, continuing toward the shelves behind me. I felt a sudden, profound, and utterly frigid slap on the back of my neck. I spun around, shouting. Nothing. But the feeling was real. The entity wasn't just manipulating space. It was mimicking my presence, walking a route I had not yet taken, mocking my movements. The ultimate confrontation occurred when the entity decided to teach the guide a final lesson. I had found a small, structural gap, a maintenance access panel, and was desperately trying to pry it open. The noise of the metal wrench on the steel was a desperate violation of the silence. The hum exploded in intensity, becoming a high-pitched, furious scream that hammered against my eardrums. The air around me began to thicken, making it difficult to breathe. The temperature dropped by 20 degrees in seconds. And then, a cold, heavy pressure slammed against the entire shelf structure. The shelves began to buckle, bending inward, pinning me against the wall. I was screaming into my mic, struggling against the crushing weight of the steel and the thousands of books. And then the voice. It wasn't the hum. It was a clear, dry, rasping whisper right at my ear, coming from the spine of a book pressed against my face. You knew the exits, Alex. You knew the exits. It was the archivist, the forgotten curator, the keeper of the lost knowledge. It was furious that I, the guide, had broken into its sanctuary, and it was punishing me by destroying the very architecture I prided myself on knowing. I managed to push the shelves back, throwing my entire weight against the pressure. The metal groaned and snapped, and I fell free, gasping for breath. I looked at the shelf. There, where the voice had come from, was a single, massive, leather-bound volume. Its title, pressed in faded gold foil, read, A Catalogue of Misplaced Intention. I grabbed the book and threw it down. The moment the book hit the concrete, the heavy pressure vanished. The hum instantly dropped back to a faint, distant whine. The air cleared. I turned. The dead-end wall, the one that had blocked my escape, was gone. The immense, steel vault door stood right where it should have been, unlocked. The archivist hadn't simply trapped me. It had created a psychological puzzle, forcing me to realize that my knowledge was useless, and that the only way to escape was to reject the reality of its geometry. I ran. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't grab my expensive gear. I ran up the winding stairwell, burst out of the vault, and scrambled out the way I came. I am no longer a guide. I am a librarian now. I work in a clean, modern building, meticulously archiving digital files. I never touch a book. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the stacks, working on a complex classification problem, I feel a strange pressure on the small of my back, right where the cold slap hit me. And in the silence of the library, I hear a faint, high-pitched whine. It's the hum. And I know the archivist is still there, deep in the foundations of the Curiosity Institute, waiting for the demolition, and patiently reminding me that all guides, no matter how good, eventually make the mistake of knowing too much.